Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. I was at the train station late at night, waiting for the last train to get home. The platform was almost empty, just a couple of people sitting around, spaced out. The air was cold, and I kept my hands in my jacket pockets, trying not to let the chill get to me. The train was supposed to come in about 10 minutes, so I leaned against the wall and stared at the tracks. That's when I noticed him. He wasn't there when I first sat down. I was sure of that. He must have come in quietly because I didn't hear the footsteps. He sat 2 benches down from me, hunched forward with his elbows on his knees. His clothes were dark, the kind of worn-out stuff you don't really notice unless you're looking for it. He had a hood up, but I could see his face, or at least a part of it that wasn't shadowed. Pale, thin, unshaven. At first, I didn't think much of it. People look rough sometimes, especially this late at night. I glanced at him, then looked away, trying not to stare. But then I heard it, the muttering. Soft at first, almost like he was talking to himself. I couldn't make out the words, just the low sound of his voice. It wasn't angry, but it wasn't calm either. It had this tone to it, like he was arguing with someone who wasn't there. I shifted uncomfortably and looked at the clock. 8 minutes. I could handle 8 minutes. The muttering got louder. I glanced over again, trying to be subtle. His head was tilted slightly, and he was rubbing his hands together like he was trying to warm them up. But his lips were moving non-stop, and his eyes, they weren't focused on anything. They darted around, quick and nervous, like he was checking for something. Or someone. I looked away again. My gut was starting to twist in that way it does when you know something's off, even if you can't explain it. The muttering stopped for a moment, and I thought maybe he'd noticed me staring. I didn't dare look back. Then I felt it. That strange, crawling sensation you get when you're being watched. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I turned my head just slightly, enough to catch him out of the corner of my eye. He was looking right at me. His eyes locked onto mine like he'd been waiting for me to notice. He didn't blink. His mouth wasn't moving anymore, but his hands were still rubbing together, faster now. I turned away quickly, my heart thudding in my chest. 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes. I decided to move. Staying in one spot made me feel too exposed. I stood up and walked toward the far end of the platform, keeping my pace steady, like I wasn't in a hurry. I didn't look back, but I could feel his eyes on me. I could almost hear him standing up. I stopped near one of the pillars and leaned against it, trying to act casual. I took out my phone and stared at the screen, not really seeing anything. I was just trying to keep my hands from shaking. Then I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate. They weren't coming straight toward me, they were wandering, like someone was pacing but didn't want to seem obvious. I glanced up from my phone, and there he was, walking along the edge of the platform. His back was to me, but he wasn't walking away. He was circling. I put my phone back in my pocket and forced myself to breathe. The train would be here soon. All I had to do was wait. But then the footsteps stopped. I looked up again, and he was facing me now, standing still about 20 feet away. His head was tilted, like he was trying to figure something out. His hands were still moving, but now they were fidgeting with something in his pocket. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and walked toward the stairs leading up to the street. I'd call a cab or an Uber. Anything to get me out of there. My footsteps echoed in the empty station, but I could hear his too. He was following me. I sped up, my heart pounding. The stairs were just ahead. I could feel him getting closer, his footsteps quickening to match mine. I broke into a jog, taking the steps 2 at a time. When I reached the top, I glanced back. He was halfway up the stairs, his hood still up, his face shadowed. But I could see his mouth moving again. He was muttering. I didn't wait to hear what he was saying. I ran toward the street, looking for any sign of a cab or a car. The street was mostly empty, just a few parked vehicles and dim streetlights casting long shadows. My phone was in my hand now, and I was trying to pull up a rideshare app, but my hands were shaking so much I could barely type. Then I heard him again. His footsteps were heavier now, faster. He wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. He was running. I turned down an alley, hoping to lose him, but it was a mistake. The alley was narrow, with tall buildings on either side and no way out except the way I came. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to calm my breathing, trying to think. Maybe he'd run past, or maybe he wouldn't follow me in here. But he did. He stopped at the mouth of the alley, his silhouette framed by the streetlights. He stood there for a moment, his head turning slowly as he scanned the darkness. Then he stepped forward, his hands still in his pockets. I didn't wait. I ran to the back of the alley, hoping to find something, an open door, a fire escape, anything. But there was nothing. Just a dead end. His footsteps were getting closer. I turned around, my back to the wall, and faced him. My phone was still in my hand, and I held it up like a weapon. "Stay back," I said, my voice shaking. He stopped, just a few feet away. His face was clearer now under the dim light. His eyes were wide, his pupils dark and unsteady. His mouth twitched as he spoke, his voice low and sharp. "You took it," he said. "You know you did." "I didn't take anything," I said. "I don't even know you." He didn't respond. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a knife. The blade caught the light, and my stomach dropped. He held it low, his grip tight. "Give it back," he said, stepping closer. I didn't think. I just acted. I threw my phone at him, hitting him in the shoulder. It startled him just enough for me to push past him and run back toward the street. I could hear him yelling behind me, but I didn't stop. I ran out of the alley and into the road, waving my arms at an oncoming car. The car screeched to a stop, and the driver rolled down the window, looking confused. "Help me," I gasped. "Please, help me." The driver must have seen the fear on my face because they unlocked the door without asking any questions. I jumped in, slamming the door behind me, and looked back. The man was standing at the edge of the alley, his knife still in hand. He didn't follow me this time. He just stood there, watching as the car pulled away. I didn't look back again. I didn't stop shaking until I was home. It was a weekend trip with a group of friends. We went up to a smaller resort that we heard about from some locals, a place that wasn't too crowded but had enough terrain to keep us entertained for a couple of days. The snow was perfect, fresh powder from a storm the night before, and the weather was clear, ideal for hitting the slopes. I'd been snowboarding for years, so I wasn't worried about getting hurt or anything, and I loved exploring parts of the mountain that weren't as populated. We stuck to the main trails for the first few hours, but after a while, I wanted to go off-piste. I had this itch to try something new, away from the crowd. I told the group I'd meet them back at the lodge later. They were cool with it, some of them more into skiing, and they didn't mind sticking to the groomed runs. I grabbed my gear, made sure I had my phone, and set off toward a trail that didn't look too far from the main path but was a little more isolated. The snow was deep, untouched in places, and I felt a rush of excitement as I made my way further away from the main resort. It was peaceful out there, just the sound of the snow beneath my board and the occasional gust of wind. I wasn't really paying attention to how much time had passed, and before I knew it, I had strayed further off the trail than I meant to. I checked my phone for a map, but there was no service, no way to get a signal. It didn't faze me at first. I'd been in the mountains before and had gotten lost once or twice, but I knew how to find my way back. I turned around and started retracing my steps, but the snow had started to fall again, light but steady, and the tracks I'd made were already getting covered up. I kept moving, trying to remember the landmarks I had passed. After a while, I realized that the mountain looked different than I remembered. I couldn't see the resort, no familiar trails or signs that pointed me back. The trees were thick here, and I was beginning to feel a bit of panic creeping in. That's when I saw the cabin. It wasn't huge, but it was there, a little wood cabin tucked in between a cluster of tall pines. I could make out smoke coming from a chimney, so I thought maybe it was a ranger cabin or something like that. Maybe someone could help me get back to the resort. I'd never been off trail this far before, but I figured it couldn't hurt to ask. I snowboarded closer, calling out a few times to see if anyone was home. No response. The door was closed, but there was a light on in one of the windows, and that made me feel a little more hopeful. I knocked on the door, waiting for a few moments, then knocked again. Still no answer. I was about to leave when I heard a door creak open from inside. A man stepped out, tall and wearing a thick jacket, gloves, and a beanie. He had a serious look on his face, not exactly unfriendly, but not warm either. I asked him if he knew the way back to the resort, mentioned that I had gotten lost while exploring, and just needed a little direction. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he just stared at me for a moment, then glanced over his shoulder as if checking something behind him. He said something about how this area wasn't part of the resort, that I shouldn't be this far out. I thought he was just a local or maybe someone who worked at the resort, so I explained that I didn't mean to wander this far off. I just needed a way back. That's when things started to get weird. He didn't move toward the cabin or offer to help. Instead, he stepped forward a little, closing the space between us. He asked if I was alone. I said yes, that I'd been out by myself. Then he looked me in the eyes for a second, and I don't know what it was, but something in the way he looked at me made me feel uncomfortable. Like I had done something wrong by being there. He told me I wasn't allowed to leave. I didn't really understand at first. I thought maybe he was joking, but he didn't laugh. There was no smile, just this cold expression. He told me again, in a firm voice, that I wasn't leaving, and then he stepped aside, revealing that he had something in his hand. A rifle. Not a small one, either. It was big, and it was pointed down, but he was holding it like he was ready to use it if he had to. I froze. I tried to think. I tried to tell myself that maybe I was misunderstanding the situation, that there was a logical explanation for this. But I couldn't make sense of it. Why would someone in a place like this be so aggressive? Why would someone with a rifle tell me I couldn't leave? I thought about bolting, but then I realized how dangerous that could be. He could easily catch up to me, or worse, and the last thing I wanted was to find myself in a worse situation. So, I stood there, trying to think of what to do next. I asked him again, "What do you mean?" "I just need to get back to the resort." He didn't answer right away, just stared at me again for a long moment. Then, he said that he was just doing his job, that the land around here wasn't for people like me. I tried to make sense of it, but it wasn't adding up. I asked him if he was a ranger or if this was some kind of private property, but he didn't respond to that. He just said that I shouldn't have come here, and that now it was too late. At this point, I was feeling a real surge of fear. I knew I needed to get away, but I didn't know how to do it. He hadn't made any move to actually hurt me yet, but the way he was standing there with that rifle in hand was making my heart race. I didn't want to push him, but I didn't know what else to do. I started trying to talk my way out of it, telling him I wasn't there to cause any trouble, that I was just lost and needed help getting back. But he wasn't having it. He told me again that I wasn't leaving. I was starting to realize that this wasn't just some random encounter, that I had stumbled onto something that wasn't meant for me. I didn't know what was going on, but I had a bad feeling about it. I turned around slowly, trying to act calm, and started to back up toward the snow. He told me not to move, but I didn't stop. My instincts were telling me to get out of there. I turned to snowboard away, and that's when I heard him shout something, but I didn't stop to hear the words. I just kept going, riding as fast as I could, not daring to look behind me. The whole way down, my mind raced. I didn't know what the man's intentions were, but I was sure he wasn't someone I should have trusted. I didn't know if he was alone up there, or if he had other people with him. I didn't know how long he had been living out there or what he was doing, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I eventually made it back to the resort, breathless, terrified, but safe. I didn't tell anyone about what happened, because honestly, I wasn't sure anyone would believe me. Even now, I don't know exactly what that man was up to. But I'll tell you this, I never went back to those woods. And every time I hear someone talk about the mountains, about that place, I feel that same sense of dread. There's something off about that area. Something that doesn't want people around. It happened a few months ago, and I still can't believe it. I was driving through the desert, heading to a job out west. It was one of those stretches of highway where you can go hours without seeing another car or a building. Just miles of sand, scrubby bushes, and the occasional cactus. I'd been on the road all day, and the sun was starting to set, the light fading into the deep orange that paints everything in long shadows. It should have been peaceful, but I had this nagging worry my fuel gauge was getting close to empty. I'd passed a sign about 20 miles back that said there was a gas station up ahead, so I kept going, hoping I'd make it before running out. But, of course, the needle dipped lower, and the engine started sputtering before I saw anything. I coasted as far as I could and pulled over to the shoulder. There was nothing around but the sound of the wind brushing over the sand. I grabbed a flashlight and my phone, which was barely holding a charge, and started walking. I figured the station couldn't be too far. After what felt like a mile or so, I finally saw it, a rundown gas station just off the highway. The place looked like it had been abandoned for years. The sign was half falling down, and the windows were all covered in grime. Still, I thought maybe there'd be something there, an old gas can, maybe someone who could help. Anything. When I got closer, I saw the pumps were completely rusted out. The station itself had its front door hanging open, creaking softly in the wind. I hesitated before stepping inside. It was dark, but my flashlight cut through enough to see the place was a wreck. Shelves were knocked over, and trash was scattered everywhere. It smelled stale, like mold and dust. I started looking around, keeping the flashlight low. There were some old cans of food, but they were bloated and clearly not safe to eat. I found an old toolbox on one of the shelves and grabbed it, thinking it might come in handy. That's when I felt it, like someone was watching me. You know that prickly feeling on the back of your neck? It was like that, but stronger. I swung the flashlight around, but the beam only landed on empty aisles and dusty corners. I told myself it was just my nerves. The place was creepy, sure, but I was alone. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. Then I heard a soft shuffle, like a footstep, coming from the back of the store. My heart jumped into my throat. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" My voice sounded too loud, almost shaky. No answer, just the wind pushing through the broken windows. I stepped back, keeping the flashlight pointed toward the noise. The shuffling stopped, but I thought I saw something move in the shadows. It was quick, like someone ducking out of sight. That was enough for me. I turned and bolted for the door, toolbox clanging in my hand. When I got outside, I glanced back over my shoulder. I didn't see anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I started walking back to my car, faster this time. The desert was pitch black by then, and my flashlight wasn't doing much against the dark. The air felt colder, and every little noise made me jump. When I finally saw my car up ahead, I felt a wave of relief. But as I got closer, that relief turned to dread. The driver's side door was open. I knew I'd locked it before I left. My chest tightened, and I slowed my steps, scanning around with the flashlight. There was no one in sight, but the inside of the car looked off. The glove box was open, papers were scattered on the seat, and the back door was ajar. Someone had been in there. I reached the car and peeked inside, half expecting someone to jump out at me. But it was empty. I checked my phone. The battery was dead. Figures. I tried to start the car, but it wouldn't even turn over. Popping the hood, I saw why the wires had been cut. My heart sank. Someone had done this while I was at the station. That's when I heard it again, footsteps, this time on the gravel behind me. Slow, deliberate. I whipped around, flashlight trembling in my hand, and finally saw him. A man stood just at the edge of the light, half hidden in the dark. He was tall and thin, wearing a dirty jacket and jeans. His face was mostly shadowed, but I could see the glint of his eyes staring at me. He didn't say anything, just stood there, watching. My mouth went dry, and my hand shook so bad I almost dropped the flashlight. "What do you want?" I managed to say, my voice cracking. He didn't answer. Instead, he took a step closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. I backed up until I hit the car, my mind racing. I still had the toolbox in my hand, so I gripped it tight, ready to swing if I had to. "Stay back," I shouted. My voice echoed into the empty night. The man stopped, tilting his head slightly, like he was sizing me up. Then he took another step. I didn't wait to see what he'd do next. I turned and ran, leaving the car and everything else behind. My legs burned as I sprinted down the highway, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if he was following. After what felt like forever, I saw headlights coming toward me. I waved my arms, yelling and stumbling into the middle of the road. The car slowed, and a woman rolled down her window, looking concerned. "Are you okay?" she asked. I could barely get the words out, telling her someone was back at my car. She told me to get in, and I didn't hesitate. We drove to the nearest town, about 20 miles away. I told the cops everything, but when they went back to check, my car was gone. The only thing they found was the toolbox I'd dropped and some footprints leading into the desert. They said it was probably some drifter or maybe a car thief, but I don't know. Something about that man felt wrong. Like he'd been waiting for someone to come along. I've thought about it a lot since then, and I'm just glad I got out of there. I don't know what would have happened if I'd stayed, and I don't want to know. All I can say is, if you ever find yourself out in the desert, low on gas, and thinking about walking to some old station for help, don't. It was late, maybe around 11:30 p.m. The store was dead quiet like it usually was on weeknights. I worked the night shift at a small convenience store just off the highway, mostly stocking shelves, cleaning, and ringing up the occasional traveler who needed gas or snacks. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and I liked the solitude most nights. I was behind the counter checking the expiration dates on a box of candy bars when I noticed him. He'd come in without a sound, no bell from the door chime or anything. Just there, standing by the drink coolers at the back of the store. I don't even know how long he'd been there before I looked up. He was tall, maybe mid-30s, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face and a dark jacket that looked too big for him. He wasn't holding anything, just standing there like he was browsing but not really looking at anything. At first, I thought maybe he was trying to decide on a drink or something, so I went back to my task. After a few minutes, I glanced up again. He hadn't moved, still standing in the same spot with his back to me. Something about it felt off. People don't usually linger in a convenience store for long, especially not at that hour. I cleared my throat, more to make myself feel less awkward than to get his attention. "Let me know if you need any help," I said. He didn't respond. Didn't even turn around. Just kept standing there. The air felt heavier after that, like the silence in the store was pressing down on me. I tried to shake it off. Maybe he was just indecisive or shy. I went back to what I was doing, but I couldn't focus. Every few seconds, my eyes would flick back to him. He still hadn't moved. Finally, I decided to break the tension. "Looking for anything in particular?" I asked, louder this time. My voice echoed more than I expected, and it made me flinch. This time, he moved. Slowly, he turned his head toward me, but not all the way. I couldn't see his face clearly under the brim of his hat, just the faint glint of his eyes catching the fluorescent lights. He didn't say anything, just looked at me for a moment before turning back to the cooler. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I told myself he was probably harmless, just weird or socially awkward. But I couldn't ignore the way my instincts were screaming at me. Something about him felt wrong. Eventually, he grabbed a bottle of water from the cooler and walked up to the counter. His steps were slow and deliberate, almost like he was dragging them. He set the bottle down and stood there, not saying a word. I rang it up, trying to keep my hands steady. "That'll be $1.79, I said, forcing a smile. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled $5 bill. His hand lingered on the counter a moment longer than necessary before letting go of the money. I gave him his change, which he didn't take. He just stood there, staring at me. "Do you need a bag?" I asked, my voice shaky now. He shook his head, grabbed the bottle, and walked toward the door. But he didn't leave. He stopped just inside the doorway, standing with his back to me again, like he was looking at the rack of brochures for nearby attractions. I felt trapped. I couldn't just ask him to leave. It wasn't against the rules to hang around the store. But I didn't want him there. I couldn't focus on anything else, couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me even when his back was turned. After what felt like forever, he finally walked out. The bell above the door jingled as he left, and I exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours. I walked to the window and watched him. He didn't get into a car or walk down the highway. He just stood in the parking lot, leaning against the light post with his bottle of water in one hand, staring at the store. I tried to ignore him and focus on closing up. I locked the doors at midnight, counted the cash in the register, and shut off most of the lights. But when I looked out the window again, he was still there, just standing under the dim glow of the parking lot light. I couldn't leave while he was out there. My car was parked on the far side of the lot, and the thought of walking past him made my skin crawl. I considered calling the police, but what would I say? A guy bought a bottle of water and stood in the parking lot? It wasn't illegal to hang around. I waited another 20 minutes, hoping he'd leave, but he didn't. If anything, he'd moved closer to my car. Eventually, I couldn't wait any longer. I grabbed my keys and my phone, stuffed them into my pocket, and walked to the door. I unlocked it, stepped outside, and locked it again behind me. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. He didn't move at first, just watched as I walked toward my car. I kept my eyes straight ahead, my pace quick but not frantic. When I got about halfway there, I heard him shift behind me, the scuff of his shoes against the asphalt. "Hey," he called out. His voice was low and rough, the kind that didn't invite conversation. I ignored him and kept walking. "Hey," he called again, louder this time. "I'm talking to you." I reached my car and fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the lock. I glanced over my shoulder and saw him walking toward me now, his steps faster and more deliberate. "Wait," he shouted, and I could hear the anger in his voice now. "You took something from me." I didn't wait to find out what he meant. I yanked the door open, jumped in, and locked it behind me. As I started the car, he reached the driver's side window and slammed his hand against it. The sound made me scream. "You took it," he yelled, his face twisted with rage. I still couldn't make out his features clearly in the dim light, but I could see his teeth, clenched and bared like an animal. I threw the car into reverse and backed out of the parking spot as fast as I could. He pounded on the window again, harder this time, but I didn't stop. I shifted into drive and sped out of the lot, not looking back. When I finally got home, I locked every door and window and sat in the middle of the living room, shaking. I don't know what he wanted or what he thought I'd taken, but I've never been so scared in my life. I quit the job the next day. It happened late one night when I was driving home from a friend's place. I'd stayed later than I meant to, and by the time I left, the roads were empty. I decided to take a back road to save some time, even though it wasn't well lit. I'd driven it before, and it was usually quiet, just a stretch of dark trees and the occasional curve. I figured I'd be home in less than an hour if I kept a steady pace. The first time I saw the car, it was parked on the side of the road with its hazards on. The flash of the orange lights caught my attention as I rounded a bend. The car was pulled off onto the shoulder, slanted awkwardly like it had been left in a hurry. There was a man standing next to it, waving his arms. I slowed down just a little, squinting to get a better look. He looked scruffy, like he'd been out there for a while. His clothes were loose and rumpled, and his hair was messy, sticking out from under a baseball cap. He waved at me again, stepping closer to the road. Something about him made my stomach turn. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was the way he moved, quick and jerky, or the way he kept glancing around like he was checking for something. I didn't stop. I swerved a little to give him space and kept driving. In my mirror, I saw him lower his arms and just stand there, watching my car disappear. It gave me a weird feeling, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe his car really was broken down, and he was just hoping someone would stop and help. Still, I locked my doors and pressed a little harder on the gas. A couple of miles passed, and I started to relax. The road was straight, and there wasn't much to see except the occasional deer darting off into the woods. I turned on the radio to fill the silence, keeping the volume low so I could still hear the hum of the engine. Then I noticed headlights behind me. They weren't there before, I was sure of that. I checked my mirror again, thinking it might be another car that had come up from a side road. But it wasn't just another car. It was the same one I passed. I recognized the shape of it, the way the hazards had flashed unevenly when I'd driven by. The car stayed back at first, keeping a steady distance. I told myself it was probably nothing, just someone who'd managed to get their car running again. But then the headlights turned off. My hands tightened on the wheel. The road ahead was dark, and without the glare of his lights, it was like he'd disappeared. I glanced in the mirror again, but I couldn't see him anymore. Just blackness. I tried to focus on driving, telling myself it didn't mean anything. Maybe he just turned them off because he didn't want to blind me. People did that sometimes, right? But the hair on the back of my neck wouldn't settle. I kept checking the mirror, squinting into the dark. I thought I saw a shape back there, faint and blurry, but I couldn't be sure. Then I felt it. The rumble of another engine, close enough to vibrate through my car. He was tailing me now, close enough that I could see the outline of his car in the faint moonlight. His lights stayed off. I pressed on the gas, picking up speed. The road was narrow, with sharp turns that made my stomach lurch. I didn't want to go too fast and lose control, but I couldn't just let him stay there. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear the radio anymore. I reached for the dial and turned it off, the silence making everything feel sharper, louder. The car behind me sped up to match my pace. He stayed right on my bumper, close enough that I could almost feel him pushing me forward. I thought about slamming on the brakes, but I was too scared of what he'd do if I stopped. My hands were shaking now, slippery with sweat as I gripped the wheel. Another turn came up, and I took it too fast, the tires skidding slightly on the gravel. The car behind me didn't slow down. If anything, he got closer. I could see his silhouette in the driver's seat now, dark and motionless. I spotted a narrow driveway up ahead, barely visible through the trees. I made a snap decision and veered into it, hoping to lose him. The driveway was rough, bouncing my car as I sped down it. I could feel every rock and dip, the jolt rattling through my teeth. My headlights lit up an old gate at the end, chained shut. There was nowhere to go. I slammed on the brakes and turned off the engine, killing the lights. My chest was heaving, my breaths loud and uneven. I ducked down in my seat, trying to make myself small. Through the rear window, I saw his car slow as it passed the driveway. He must have noticed me turn off because he stopped in the middle of the road, just sitting there. I couldn't see him anymore, but I knew he was there. My car felt like a trap, too small and too exposed. I didn't dare move, barely even breathing as I waited. Seconds stretched into minutes, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. Then I heard it, the crunch of gravel under tires. He was backing up, inching closer to the driveway. I sank lower in my seat, my fingers digging into the fabric of the door. The sound stopped, and I saw the faint glow of his headlights again as he pulled into the driveway behind me. Panic flooded my chest. I reached for my phone, but my fingers were trembling too much to get a grip on it. I dropped it between the seats, the clatter loud in the stillness. I didn't dare reach down to grab it. His car stopped about 20 feet away, and the engine went silent. I could hear him getting out, his boots crunching on the gravel. He moved slowly, deliberately, like he knew I was watching. His shape appeared in the faint moonlight, tall and angular, his head turning as he scanned the area. I couldn't stay in the car. I unlocked the door as quietly as I could and slipped out, keeping low. The trees were thick on either side of the driveway, their shadows stretching long and dark across the ground. I crept toward them, trying not to make a sound. Behind me, I heard him muttering. Low and steady, like he was talking to himself. I couldn't make out the words, but his tone sent a chill through me. I pressed into the trees, crouching behind a thick trunk. My legs were shaking, and my breath was coming too fast. I clamped a hand over my mouth, trying to stay quiet. He walked past my car, his boots scraping against the gravel. His muttering grew louder, angrier, but I still couldn't make out the words. He stopped near the gate, his head turning toward the woods. I thought for sure he'd seen me. Then his voice changed. He was yelling now, loud and sharp, the words still jumbled and incoherent. He kicked at the gate, the metal rattling in the quiet. I stayed frozen, too scared to move. After what felt like hours, he finally turned back toward his car. His footsteps were slower now, his muttering quieter. I heard the car door slam, and the engine roared to life. The headlights came on, lighting up the driveway for a brief, terrifying moment. Then he reversed back onto the road and sped away. I stayed hidden in the woods until I couldn't hear the engine anymore. When I finally got the courage to move, I crawled back to my car, my legs so weak I could barely stand. My phone was still wedged between the seats, and I fumbled to pull it out, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. By the time the police arrived, he was long gone. I gave them a description, but I didn't even know what he looked like. Just his car, his muttering, and the way he chased me like I was something he needed to catch. I moved out to the cabin because I wanted to be alone. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small place off a logging road deep in the woods. I didn't have a mailbox or any utilities. I had a generator, a well for water, and a wood stove. Most days, I chopped wood, hunted, or checked my traps. It was the kind of life I wanted, quiet and simple. The first sign something wasn't right came about 2 weeks after I moved in. I'd gone out to check my traps one morning and was gone for a few hours. When I got back, I noticed the latch on my shed was open. I always kept it shut tight because the wind could rip it open, and I didn't want critters getting inside. But there it was, swinging back and forth in the breeze. At first, I thought I might have left it unlatched by accident. I checked inside, and nothing was missing, just some tools and a few bags of feed I hadn't unpacked yet. I closed it up, made sure it was locked, and didn't think much more about it. A few days later, it happened again. I'd been out fishing at a stream about a mile from the cabin. When I got back, the shed was open. This time, I knew I'd locked it because I'd double-checked before I left. Again, nothing was missing. But the fact that someone might have been on my property made my skin crawl. I figured it could have been a hunter or a hiker who got turned around. It was rare to see anyone this deep in the woods, but not impossible. I started paying more attention after that. I checked for footprints around the cabin and the shed, but the ground was hard and covered in leaves, so I didn't see anything. I also started carrying my rifle with me when I went out, just in case. It wasn't paranoia, I told myself. It was just being careful. A week later, I found something that made my stomach drop. I'd been out gathering firewood all day. When I got back, there was a piece of paper pinned to my front door with a nail. It was an old scrap torn from a grocery bag or something, rough around the edges and wrinkled. There was a drawing on it, done with a pencil or maybe charcoal. It was a crude map, just a few lines showing the logging road, the stream, and my cabin marked with an X. Whoever made it knew exactly where I was. I stood there staring at it, my hand gripping the door frame so hard it hurt. I tore the paper down and crumpled it up, my heart racing. I didn't know what to think. Was someone just messing with me, or was it something more serious? Either way, it wasn't good. I decided then and there I wasn't going to leave the property again without locking everything up tight. That night, I sat by the wood stove with my rifle across my lap. I kept the lights off and listened to the woods outside. The wind rattled the windows, and the trees creaked in the cold. Every little sound put me on edge. I barely slept. The next morning, I started making changes. I rigged up some makeshift alarms around the property, tin cans on strings, little things that would rattle if someone came too close. I also cleared some of the brush around the cabin so I have a better line of sight. It wasn't much, but it made me feel a little safer. A few days went by, and nothing happened. I started to think maybe whoever it was had moved on. Then, one night, I woke up to a noise. It was faint, just a soft clinking sound, but it was enough to jolt me awake. I sat up in bed, my pulse pounding. The cabin was pitch dark, and for a moment, I thought I might have imagined it. Then I heard it again, louder this time. It was coming from outside, near the shed. I grabbed my rifle and crept to the window. The moon was bright enough to see the yard, but I didn't see anyone. The shed door was swinging open again, the tin cans I'd strung up around it clinking together in the breeze. I stood there for what felt like forever, watching and listening. Finally, I worked up the nerve to go outside. I stepped onto the porch, the rifle tight in my hands, and scanned the yard. Everything looked still. The woods were silent except for the wind. I walked to the shed, my breath fogging in the cold air, and shone my flashlight inside. It was empty, just like before. But this time, there was something new. In the dirt near the doorway, I saw footprints. They were fresh, too big to be mine, and leading away into the trees. I followed them a little way, but they disappeared into the brush where the ground was too hard to leave marks. I didn't like the idea of chasing someone into the woods at night, so I went back to the cabin and locked myself inside. The next day, I went into town to talk to the sheriff. I didn't know what else to do. He listened to my story and said he'd send someone out to take a look, but I could tell he didn't take it seriously. Probably just a hunter or a kid messing around, he said. I didn't feel any better after that. Whoever it was knew I was there. They knew how to get to my property and where I kept my things. And they'd been watching me. That night, I stayed up late, sitting by the window with my rifle. Around midnight, I saw movement in the trees. It was just a shadow at first, a dark shape slipping between the trunks. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Then I saw him, a man, walking slowly toward the cabin. He wasn't carrying a flashlight, just moving quietly through the woods like he'd done it 100 times before. He stopped about 20 yards from the cabin and stood there, staring. I couldn't see his face, but I could feel his eyes on me. I raised the rifle and aimed at him through the window. My hands were shaking, but I kept him in my sights. He didn't move. For a long moment, we just stared at each other, the glass between us the only thing keeping me from pulling the trigger. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees without a sound. I didn't sleep at all that night. At dawn, I packed up what I could and left. I didn't want to find out what he was planning. Maybe it was nothing, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I haven't been back to the cabin since. I had been driving for hours. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the empty road. I wasn't on a highway or even a main road, really. It was one of those desolate country routes, surrounded by trees and nothing else for miles. I had taken this route before, but something about the quietness of the road, the fading daylight, felt different that day. It was like everything was just too still, too empty. The car had been running fine, just the usual hum of the engine. But about 10 miles into the stretch, the car started sputtering. At first, I thought it was just the fuel running low, but when I checked, the gauge was still showing over half a tank. I gave it another mile, hoping it was just a glitch, but the car sputtered again, this time worse than before, and I knew it wasn't going to make it much further. I pulled over to the side of the road, trying to stay calm, but the place was so isolated, it made me feel uneasy. I hadn't seen a single car pass since I left the small town I had been staying in. The air was thick with silence. No birds, no wind. Just stillness. I tried to start the car again, but it didn't even make a sound. Great, I thought. Now what? My phone had no service out here. Of course, it didn't. I didn't want to panic, but the longer I sat in that car, the more the unease grew. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw headlights approaching in the distance. Relief washed over me for a moment. Someone else was out here. Maybe they could help. I pulled the keys from the ignition and opened the car door, stepping out onto the road. The truck slowed down as it neared me, coming to a stop a few feet behind my car. I could see the driver inside, a silhouette behind the headlights. The truck had a dull, gray color, a bit weathered, but nothing out of the ordinary. I waved, trying to keep my tone friendly, despite the knot forming in my stomach. Hey, my car broke down. Do you have a phone I can borrow, or maybe some jumper cables? I asked, stepping toward the truck. The driver didn't respond right away. He just stared at me through the windshield. I couldn't make out his face, but there was something about his stillness that made me feel uneasy. His truck was large, a beat-up model, and I could hear the engine idling. The longer he just sat there, the more my stomach twisted. Hello? I said again, my voice rising slightly, still trying to keep it calm. Finally, he slowly rolled down the window. His face appeared in the dim light. A middle-aged man with a weathered, grizzled look, his eyes hidden under the brim of a cap. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He just looked at me for a moment, then, without saying a word, he put the truck in gear and started driving slowly around my car. I froze, watching as he maneuvered his truck around the back of my car, the headlights blinding me for a moment as they passed. I stood still, not sure what to do. I wanted to move, but something told me not to. The truck didn't stop. Instead, it made a slow, deliberate loop around the vehicle, coming to a stop again right in front of me. The man didn't look at me again. He just stared straight ahead, his face half shadowed in the dim light. My heart began to pound in my chest. What was he doing? Why was he circling my car like that? It didn't make any sense. I tried to stay calm, but my mind was racing. I should have just gotten back in the car, locked the door, and driven away, but I didn't. I felt paralyzed, like my feet were glued to the ground. Then, he did something even stranger. The truck sat there, motionless for a long moment, and I felt my own breath catch in my throat. I was about to call out again, but before I could, the man suddenly shifted the truck into reverse and started to back up slowly, straight toward me. I took a step back, my heart leaping in my chest, but the truck didn't stop. It kept coming closer. I turned to look behind me, realizing that if I didn't move, I'd be backed right into my own car. My instincts kicked in, and I bolted to the side of the road, out of the truck's path. I looked back, feeling the sharp bite of the cold wind as I ran, and saw the truck come to a slow stop just where I had been standing. I couldn't breathe. Every part of me was telling me to get back into my car and drive away. But the truck didn't move. It just stayed there, and the man in the driver's seat didn't even make a move. He was just sitting there, his face still hidden under that hat, staring straight ahead. I stood off to the side, hands trembling, trying to figure out what I should do. I thought about making a run for it, but that seemed foolish. I didn't know if he had a weapon. I didn't know if he was alone. My phone, of course, had no service. I was completely alone out here, with this stranger circling my car, giving me the feeling that something was wrong. After what felt like forever, the man slowly rolled down his window again. "You need help?" he asked, his voice low and rough. I could barely speak. I nodded, my mouth dry, but I wasn't sure if I wanted help from him anymore. "I can give you a ride to town," he said, the words slow and deliberate, like he was giving me an offer I shouldn't refuse. I didn't trust him. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There was something about the way he was speaking, the lack of any real emotion behind his words, that sent a chill through me. This wasn't right. I didn't know why, but every single warning bell in my head was screaming to get out of there, fast. "No, thank you," I said, my voice shaking, but I tried to keep it steady. "I'll be fine." The truck didn't move. He just kept staring at me through the window, his face still mostly hidden. "Are you sure?" he asked again, his voice now a little colder, more insistent. I backed away, not wanting to turn my back on him, but I didn't want to run either. "I'm fine," I said again, louder this time, and I moved toward my car. I could see him watching me in the side mirror, but I didn't look back. I got into my car, locked the doors, and started the engine. My hands were shaking as I drove away, my heart racing in my chest. I didn't look back at the truck, but I felt his eyes on me the entire time. When I finally hit the main road, I looked in my rearview mirror, and sure enough, the truck was still there, not far behind, but it didn't follow me. It just stayed back, watching as I drove away. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest gas station. I pulled in, parked, and locked the doors. I could feel the sweat on my palms, my legs still shaking. I don't know what would have happened if I had stayed, but I knew that whatever it was, it wouldn't have been good. I never did see that truck again, but I'll never forget the way that man circled me. That night started off like most others. I'd spent the day out in the fields, checking on the crops and making sure everything was in order for the next morning. By the time the sun was setting, I'd finished up my last task and was heading back toward the house. The sky was painted with that mix of orange and purple, and the air had that stillness it gets just before it turns completely dark. I liked that time of day, usually. It felt calm, like everything was settling in for the night. As I walked back up the gravel path toward the house, I noticed something odd near the edge of the property. There was a car parked just past the tree line, half hidden behind the brush. It wasn't a car I recognized, and it was angled in a way that made it look like whoever had left it there didn't want it to be seen from the road. I stopped and stared at it for a moment, trying to figure out why someone would park out there. My closest neighbors were miles away, and most people who passed through stuck to the main road. My land wasn't exactly a tourist spot, and there weren't any trails or places to camp nearby. It didn't make sense. I thought about walking over to check it out, but the sun was already dipping low, and I didn't like the idea of poking around someone else's car without knowing what I was walking into. I decided I'd just keep an eye on it and see if it was still there in the morning. People got lost out here sometimes, or maybe someone had car trouble and would come back for it. By the time I got inside, it was fully dark. I locked the door behind me, had a quick dinner, and sat down with a book to wind down. My dog, Max, was sprawled out by the fireplace, snoring softly. It felt quiet, the kind of quiet you only get out in the country. The thought of that car slipped to the back of my mind. Around 10 o'clock, I decided to call it a night. I checked the doors and windows like I always did, making sure everything was secure. Max followed me upstairs, and I climbed into bed, expecting another quiet night. I woke up to the sound of a bang. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to snap me out of sleep. I sat up, straining to hear if it would come again. Max was already awake, his ears perked up, and his body stiff. He let out a low growl, the kind that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. At first, I thought maybe it was the wind. It had been calm earlier, but storms could roll in quick out here. I got out of bed and grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand. Max was at my side, pacing nervously as I moved toward the window. I pulled back the curtain and looked out toward the barn. The moon was bright enough that I could make out the outline of the building, and everything looked still. But then I saw movement, a shadow crossing in front of the barn door. I froze, my mind racing. Someone was out there. I tried to convince myself it might just be an animal, but I knew it wasn't. The shadow had been too tall, too upright. My hand tightened around the flashlight, and I grabbed my phone. I debated calling the sheriff right then, but something made me stop. I wanted to see what was going on first. I crept down the stairs, keeping the flashlight off for now. Max stayed close, his growl barely audible but constant. When I reached the back door, I peeked out the window. I couldn't see the barn from that angle, but I could hear something now, a faint scraping sound, like metal on metal. I opened the door as quietly as I could and stepped out onto the porch. The cool night air hit me, and for a moment, everything felt too still. Then I heard it again, that same scraping noise. It was coming from the barn. I moved toward it slowly, keeping to the shadows. My boots crunched lightly on the gravel, and I winced at the sound. I could see the barn door now, slightly ajar, even though I knew I'd locked it earlier. The padlock was hanging loose, the latch broken. Someone had forced it open. Max stayed at my side, his body tense. I stopped a few feet away from the door, listening. There were faint sounds coming from inside now, footsteps, a shuffle of movement. Whoever it was, they were still in there. I took a deep breath and stepped closer, shining the flashlight into the barn. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on the rows of tools and equipment. For a second, I didn't see anything, but then a figure moved at the edge of the light. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice steadier than I felt. The figure froze, and for a moment, there was complete silence. Then, slowly, they stepped forward. It was a man, dressed in dark clothes with a hood pulled over his head. His face was partially hidden, but I could see enough to know he wasn't anyone I recognized. "I was just looking around," he said, his voice calm, almost casual. "Didn't mean to scare you." "Looking around?" I said, my grip tightening on the flashlight. "You broke the lock to get in here." He didn't respond to that. Instead, he took another step forward, his hands in his pockets. Something about the way he moved put me on edge, like he wasn't worried at all about being caught. "I didn't take anything," he said. "Just curious, that's all." I didn't believe him. My tools were valuable, and I heard plenty of stories about people stealing equipment from farms like mine. But something about this felt different. He wasn't in a hurry to leave, and the way he was watching me made my skin crawl. "I think you should go," I said, keeping the light on him. He tilted his head slightly, like he was considering it, but he didn't move. "You live out here alone?" he asked, his tone casual but with an edge that made my stomach twist. "That's none of your business," I said. He smiled, just a small, cold twitch of his lips. "Just making conversation." I didn't answer. My heart was pounding, and my mind was racing with what to do next. I thought about running back to the house, locking the door, and calling the sheriff, but I wasn't sure I'd make it before he followed me. Before I could decide, he took another step forward, and I saw something glint in his hand, a knife. Max growled, stepping in front of me, his body low and tense. The man stopped, his eyes flicking to the dog. "Easy," he said, his tone still calm. "No need for anyone to get hurt." I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I swung the flashlight at him, hard, aiming for his hand. It connected with a crack, and he let out a sharp curse, dropping the knife. Max lunged at him, barking and snapping, and the man stumbled back, tripping over a rake. I grabbed the knife and backed toward the door, yelling for Max to follow. The man was still on the ground, cursing and trying to get up, but I didn't wait to see if he'd come after me. I ran for the house, slamming the door behind me and locking it. I called the sheriff right away, my hands shaking as I explained what had happened. They arrived about 20 minutes later, but by the time they searched the barn and the property, the man was gone. They found the car near the tree line, abandoned. The sheriff said it looked like the guy had been planning to take more than just tools. There was rope and duct tape in the car, along with a few other things I didn't want to think about. They never caught him, but I installed security cameras and reinforced the locks after that. I still think about that night every time I walk out to the barn. I don't know what he wanted, but I'm glad I didn't wait to find out. The night shifts at the library were always quiet, almost too quiet. It was just me, the books, and the faint hum of the air conditioning. Most nights, I welcomed the solitude. I could sort returns, straighten the shelves, and get lost in my thoughts without interruption. That night started the same as any other. The last few patrons had left at 8 p.m., and I locked the doors behind them. I had 2 hours before I could shut everything down and head home. I spent the first hour organizing the mystery section. Someone had returned a whole stack of Agatha Christie novels, and I liked putting them back where they belonged. The silence was comforting at first, the kind that felt safe. But as the clock ticked closer to closing, it started to feel heavier, like the air was pressing down on me. At 9:45, I decided to do a final walkthrough to make sure everything was in order. The library wasn't big, just one main floor with rows of bookshelves and a small reading area by the windows. I walked the aisles, straightening books and picking up stray bits of trash left behind. Everything was normal until I reached the back corner where the biographies were. That's when I saw him. He was crouched low behind one of the shelves, almost completely hidden. I only noticed him because of a flicker of movement, the way his shoes shifted against the carpet. My first thought was that it was a teenager, someone who had stayed behind as a prank. It had happened once before. Some kids thought it would be funny to hide until closing and scare me when I turned out the lights. "Excuse me," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "We're closed. You need to leave." He didn't move at first. I couldn't see his face, just the top of his head and the way his shoulders hunched forward. I took a step closer, keeping the shelf between us. "Sir?" I tried again, louder this time. He straightened slowly, like he had all the time in the world. When he stood, I realized he wasn't a teenager. He was a grown man, maybe in his late 30s or early 40s. His clothes were plain dark jeans, a gray hoodie, but there was something about the way he carried himself that put me on edge. His hands hung loose at his sides, and his head tilted slightly, like he was sizing me up. "I didn't mean to startle you," he said, his voice calm, almost polite. "We're closed," I said again. "You shouldn't be here." He didn't move. Instead, he took a small step toward me, just enough to close the distance by a few inches. "I was just looking around," he said. "It's a nice library." "You work here?" "Yes," I said, keeping my voice steady. "But you need to leave. Now." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "What's your name?" I ignored the question and took a step back. "I'm going to have to call security if you don't leave." His smile widened, and he leaned slightly against the shelf, like he wasn't in any hurry. "Security? Do you even have security here?" The question hit me harder than it should have. He was right. The library didn't have a security guard, not during my shifts. It was just me, a locked door, and the assumption that no one would bother causing trouble in a place like this. "I'll call the police," I said, reaching for my phone in my back pocket. He moved fast, stepping out from behind the shelf and blocking the aisle before I could react. "There's no need for that," he said. His tone was smooth, almost friendly, but his body language was anything but. He was too close, standing just a little too tall, and his eyes never left mine. "I'm just trying to finish my shift," I said, keeping my voice as calm as I could. "Please leave." Instead of answering, he took another step forward, forcing me to back up. "Do you work here alone?" he asked, his head tilting again. "It must get lonely." My throat tightened. "That's none of your business." He chuckled, low and soft, like I'd said something funny. "You're not very friendly, are you?" "Most people who work in places like this are friendlier." I didn't answer. My phone was still in my pocket, but I didn't want to reach for it again. He was too close, and I didn't want to give him a reason to grab me. My heart was pounding, and I was hyper-aware of how empty the building was, how far I was from the front door. "Do you live around here?" he asked. "It's a small town." "I bet you're easy to find." I tried to stay calm, but his words sent a cold rush of fear through me. "You need to leave," I said again, my voice sharper now. He didn't flinch. Instead, he took a slow step to the side, forcing me to move further into the corner. The shelves behind me felt like walls, boxing me in. "You've got a nice voice," he said, almost like he was complimenting me. "I bet people tell you that all the time." "I'm calling the police," I said, pulling my phone out and unlocking it with shaking hands. Before I could dial, he lunged forward, grabbing my wrist. "Don't," he said, his tone still calm but his grip iron tight. I twisted, trying to pull free, but he held on. "Let go!" I yelled, my voice echoing through the empty library. He didn't let go, but his smile faded. "Calm down," he said. "You're overreacting." I didn't care about overreacting. I swung my other hand, hitting his arm as hard as I could. It was enough to loosen his grip, and I yanked my wrist free, stumbling backward. He didn't come after me right away. Instead, he just stood there, his head tilted again like he was trying to figure something out. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. I didn't respond. My back hit the shelf, and I used it to steady myself before darting down the next aisle. I could hear his footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. He wasn't running, but he wasn't letting me out of his sight either. I reached the front desk and grabbed the landline phone, dialing 911 as quickly as I could. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped the receiver. 911, what's your emergency?" the operator said. "There's a man in the library," I said, my voice trembling. "He won't leave. He's threatening me." Before I could say more, he appeared at the end of the aisle, his face calm but his eyes cold. "You really didn't need to do that," he said, stepping closer. "They're on their way," I said, holding the phone like a shield. "Just leave." He stopped, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought he might actually listen, but then he took another step forward. "You think they'll get here in time?" The operator was still talking, but I couldn't focus on her words. My entire body was tense, ready to run if I had to. I backed toward the door, keeping my eyes on him. Then I heard it, the faint sound of sirens in the distance. His expression changed, a flicker of frustration crossing his face. He glanced toward the window, then back at me. "You got lucky," he said, his voice low. He turned and walked quickly toward the back of the library, disappearing between the shelves. I didn't wait to see where he went. I ran to the door, unlocking it just as the first police car pulled into the lot. The officers searched the building, but they didn't find him. They said he must have slipped out through the emergency exit before they arrived. They offered to walk me to my car and told me to call if I saw anything suspicious. I didn't sleep that night. I kept replaying his words, his calm smile, and the way he seemed to know exactly how far he could push without crossing the line. I still don't know what he wanted or why he was there, but I quit the job the next day. I moved into the house on a cold, gray afternoon. It was a quiet street with neat little homes lined up side by side, each with its own small lawn and driveway. The house wasn't big, but it felt cozy, and that's what I wanted. I had spent a lot of time looking for a place that felt safe. I'd been through a lot in the last year, and this house seemed like a fresh start. The first couple of days were a blur of unpacking and organizing. I didn't know anyone in the neighborhood yet, but it seemed like a friendly place. People waved when they passed by, and someone even left a bouquet of flowers on my front porch. There was no note, but I figured it was a welcome gift from a neighbor. The flowers were pretty, so I put them in a vase on the kitchen table. A few days later, I found another gift on the porch, a small box with a bow on top. Inside was a handwritten note that said, "Welcome to the neighborhood." There was no name, but it felt kind. The box had a few chocolates inside, so I thought maybe it was from someone on the street who didn't want to introduce themselves in person. I didn't think much of it. The gifts kept coming. A week later, there was a small basket of cookies wrapped in cellophane. The day after that, there was a little plant in a ceramic pot. It was nice, but it started to feel a bit strange. None of the gifts had a note with a name or a house number. I didn't know who was leaving them. I thought about asking around, but I didn't want to come across as ungrateful. One evening, I came home from work and found something different. It wasn't a gift, not like the others. It was a single photo, placed carefully on the porch. The picture was of me, taken from across the street. I was outside, standing by my car. The photo wasn't threatening, it just showed me unloading groceries, but it unsettled me. I looked around, but the street was quiet. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just some kid playing a prank. I thought about knocking on a few doors to ask if anyone had seen something, but I didn't know how to explain it without sounding paranoid. I threw the photo away and tried to forget about it. The next morning, I found another photo. This one was closer, taken from the sidewalk in front of my house. It was me again, sitting on the porch with my coffee. The angle made it clear that whoever took the picture had been standing right outside my house. My stomach turned. I felt exposed, like someone had been watching me without me knowing. I decided to install a camera. I bought one of those doorbell cameras and set it up that night. It made me feel a little better, knowing I could at least see who was coming to the porch. For a couple of days, nothing happened. I started to think maybe the photos were a one-time thing, just someone being weird. But then, late one night, I got a notification from the camera. There was motion at the door. I opened the app on my phone and saw someone standing there. It was a man, dressed in dark clothes, holding something in his hands. He placed it on the porch and walked away quickly, staying close to the edge of the yard where the camera couldn't see him clearly. When I opened the door, there was another box. This one wasn't wrapped like the others. It was an old shoebox, and inside were things that didn't make sense. There was a key I didn't recognize, a single earring, and a folded piece of paper. The paper had writing on it, just a few words that said, "I've always watched over you." I called the police. They sent someone out, and I showed them the box and the camera footage. The officer told me they couldn't do much since the man hadn't done anything illegal. He suggested I keep the camera running and call again if anything else happened. The next morning, there was a knock on the door. I opened it to find a man standing there, someone I'd never seen before. He looked normal enough, but there was something off about his eyes. He smiled too wide and said, "I hope you like the gifts." I felt frozen. I didn't know what to say. He didn't introduce himself or explain why he'd been leaving things on my porch. I asked him what he wanted, and he said, "I just wanted you to know I'm here." I closed the door and locked it. My hands were shaking. I called the police again, but by the time they arrived, the man was gone. They took a report and said they'd patrol the area, but I didn't feel safe anymore. I started staying with a friend after work, only coming home during the day to pick up clothes or check the house. The final straw came a week later. I went to the house to grab some things and found the back door unlocked. I knew I hadn't left it that way. When I stepped inside, the air felt different, like someone had been there. There was nothing missing, but on the kitchen counter, there was a single photo. It was of me, sleeping in my bed. I moved out that night. I didn't even pack everything, I just grabbed what I needed and left. I never went back. The police couldn't find the man or figure out who he was. I don't know how he got the photo of me sleeping or how long he had been watching me. I still think about it, especially at night. I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there somewhere, waiting. I'd been hiking alone for a few hours when I decided to stop for a quick break. It was one of those clear, quiet days, just the sound of birds and the occasional rustling in the bushes. There was a good, flat spot right off the trail, so I dropped my pack and sat down to take a drink from my water bottle. I must have zoned out a bit, staring at the trees and feeling relaxed. When I reached back to grab my backpack, it wasn't there. For a second, I thought I was imagining it. Maybe I'd put it down somewhere else. But I looked around, and it was definitely gone. I felt this twist of panic in my stomach, and I scanned the area, my eyes jumping from tree to tree, hoping maybe I'd just forgotten where I'd put it. But then, about 30 feet up the trail, I spotted a man crouched down, holding my pack. My heart started pounding. I hadn't seen anyone all day, and suddenly there was this guy, going through my stuff like he owned it. He was turned away from me, so I couldn't see his face, but he was bent over my bag, pulling things out one by one, looking at each item before setting it down in the dirt. "Hey!" I called out, walking toward him, trying to keep my voice steady. "That's my backpack." He didn't even turn around, just kept rummaging through it, like he hadn't heard me or didn't care. I got closer, and I could see his hands running over my things, almost like he was taking his time with each one. I stopped a few feet away, feeling this tightness in my throat. I said, "That's my bag," I repeated, louder this time, trying to sound firm. Finally, he turned around. He was middle-aged, rough-looking, with a scruffy beard and eyes that didn't quite meet mine. He held onto my pack, keeping it close to him, as if it was his now. He looked me over, up and down, then said, "You left it unattended." Just sitting there. His voice was flat, like he was stating a fact that justified what he was doing. I took a deep breath, keeping my voice steady. I was only gone for a minute. I just needed a break. I didn't think anyone else was out here. He didn't respond, just looked at me, still holding onto my pack. I took a step forward, reaching my hand out. "I really need that back," I said, trying not to sound as nervous as I felt. He didn't budge. Instead, he tilted his head and asked, "Where are you heading?" I froze for a second. It was such a strange question, like he wasn't really interested in returning my things. I tried to keep calm and said, "I'm just hiking through, that's all. But I need my gear." He looked at my bag again, then slowly shifted his gaze back to me. "You're hiking alone?" That question made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I hadn't told anyone I was alone. I glanced around, feeling more aware of how isolated we were. "Just give me my backpack," I said, trying to keep my voice firm but not wanting to answer anything he asked. He ignored me, still holding my things like he had every right to. He reached into my bag and pulled out my map, unfolding it with this slow, deliberate care. He stared at it, his finger tracing the route I had marked out, as if he was planning to follow it himself. "You marked this?" he asked, glancing up at me with a look that made my skin crawl. "Yeah," I said, not knowing what else to say. My voice was starting to shake now, and I felt a strange, hollow feeling in my chest. "It's my route. Look, I really need that back. Please." But he just kept staring at the map, running his finger along my planned path. He looked up again and said, "Not many people come out this far. No one around to hear you, really." His eyes met mine, and he held that stare a bit too long. I felt this wave of dread, like something heavy pressing down on me. My mind was racing, thinking about what I'd do if he tried anything. I tried to make my voice sound stronger, even though I was terrified. "Give me my backpack," I demanded, taking another step forward. He didn't move. Instead, he raised an eyebrow and asked, "You sure you're going the right way?" "What?" I asked, not understanding what he was getting at. He folded the map slowly, stuffing it back into my pack, then looked at me with this strange smile. "Just saying, you could easily get turned around out here. And no one would know." His voice was low, almost like he was enjoying himself. I took a deep breath, trying to hold my ground. "I know where I'm going. I've got my route mapped out. Now, give me my things." He stared at me, and for a long second, I thought he was going to ignore me, or worse. But then he shoved the bag toward me, not letting go until I was practically pulling it out of his hands. When I grabbed it, he leaned in close, closer than he needed to, and said in a quiet voice, "Maybe I'll see you again." My heart was pounding as I took a few steps back, not turning my back on him. I held onto my bag tight, my mind racing, but I didn't respond. I just wanted to get out of there. He watched me, that same unsettling look in his eyes, like he was memorizing my face, or maybe planning something. I turned and started walking fast, almost running, trying to put as much distance as I could between us. I glanced back a couple of times, and he was still standing there, watching me until I disappeared into the trees. I didn't stop, didn't rest, didn't look back again until I was way down the trail, far enough that I couldn't see him or hear anything. I kept my hand on the straps of my pack, clutching it close, heart racing the whole way back. I was driving through a long stretch of woods on an old road. It was late, well after midnight, and I'd been pushing it to make it through before my car started acting up. I noticed the engine light flicker a few miles back, but I didn't think much of it at first. Then, out of nowhere, the car started to shake, sputtering like it was choking on something. I barely had time to pull over before it died completely, right there in the middle of nowhere. No houses, no other cars, just trees on both sides and silence. I sat there for a minute, hoping maybe the car would just start back up if I gave it a break. But when I turned the key again, nothing but a click. I was stuck. I thought about my options. It was too late to call anyone, and my phone barely had any signal out there. The map app wouldn't load, but I figured if I followed the road back, it would eventually lead me somewhere with a signal, or at least somewhere I could find a payphone. I grabbed my coat, got out, and started walking, hoping the cold air would keep me awake. It was dead quiet, just the sound of my footsteps crunching the gravel. I walked for what felt like maybe 10, 15 minutes when I heard the rumble of a truck approaching. Relief hit me, someone to help, maybe even give me a ride. I turned and saw headlights coming up from behind, slow and steady, like they were in no rush. When the truck pulled up, it was an old beat-up pickup, rusty, like it had been through a lot. There were two guys inside. They looked rough, unshaven with caps pulled down low, and they both just stared at me through the window for a second before one of them leaned out. "Car trouble?" he asked, voice low and raspy. "Yeah. It just died on me a little ways back," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do you know if there's a gas station or anything nearby?" They looked at each other, smirking a bit, like I'd just said something funny. Then the driver turned back to me, grinning, his teeth yellow in the headlights. "Ain't much of anything out here," he said. I tried to laugh it off, but something about the way they were staring made my skin crawl. I couldn't tell if they were just messing with me or if there was something more to it. The guy in the passenger seat leaned out, sizing me up like he was trying to decide something. "You sure you're gonna be all right out here?" he asked, almost like he was mocking me. I nodded, trying to brush it off, told them I'd be fine, and they eventually drove off, laughing as they pulled away. I was just glad they were gone. I kept walking, hoping they wouldn't come back, but about 5 minutes later, I heard that rumble again. I turned, and sure enough, there they were, coming up slowly from behind, like they'd just been waiting down the road. The truck stopped, and the driver leaned out again, watching me with that same smirk. "You sure you're all right?" he asked, as if he hadn't already asked me that once. "I'm good," I said, feeling my chest tighten. "Thanks, though." The passenger chuckled, looking me up and down. "You lost or something?" "Not many folks out here at this hour." I forced a smile, hoping they'd just get bored and leave. "No, just had car trouble." "Thanks for checking." They stared at me for another few seconds, not moving, just watching me with those strange, fixed looks. Finally, they drove off again, a little faster this time, the engine roaring as they disappeared down the road. I took a deep breath, told myself it was fine, and kept walking. But a few minutes later, I heard it again, the same rumbling engine. The truck slowed down as it came up behind me, crawling along, headlights lighting up the road in front of me. This time, they didn't say anything, just kept the truck idling there, matching my pace as I walked. I stopped, and they stopped. I didn't look back, but I could feel their eyes on me, watching. Every nerve in my body was telling me to keep moving, to not look at them, not give them a reason. I picked up my pace, hoping they'd take the hint, but they just kept following, inching along, watching. After what felt like forever, the driver leaned out again. "Need a ride?" he asked, voice almost too friendly. "No, thanks," I said, not turning around. "You sure?" he pushed, sounding amused. "Wouldn't want anything happening to you out here all alone." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my breathing steady. "I'm good. I'll manage." He snickered, and the truck finally pulled forward, leaving me in the dark again. I thought maybe they were gone for good this time, that they finally had their fun. But a few minutes later, there they were again, headlights blinding me from behind, that same slow crawl as they kept up with me. They didn't say anything this time. They just followed, inch by inch, as I walked faster and faster, my heart pounding. I didn't know what they wanted, didn't know what they were waiting for. All I knew was that I needed to get away from them, but there was nowhere to go, just endless road and trees on either side. The truck finally sped up, passing me, but just a few yards ahead, it stopped, blocking the road. I stopped too, trying to figure out if I should turn back, maybe run into the woods. But before I could decide, the passenger got out, just standing there, watching me with that same blank look. "Where you headed?" he asked, voice low. "Just trying to get to the nearest town," I said, keeping my distance. He took a step toward me, smiling that same smile. "It's a long walk," he said. "You sure you don't want to ride?" I shook my head, backing up a little. He kept coming, slow and steady, like he was just toying with me. Behind him, I saw the driver watching from the truck, grinning, enjoying every second. I had to do something, anything to get away. I turned and bolted into the woods, running as fast as I could, branches snapping underfoot. I heard them laughing behind me, and then the sound of footsteps as they came after me, crunching through the leaves. I didn't look back, just kept running, heart pounding, lungs burning. I stumbled over roots and rocks, pushing through bushes, not caring where I was going, just trying to put distance between me and them. The footsteps faded after a while, but I didn't stop. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing behind a tree, gasping for air. I stayed there, hidden, listening for any sign of him, any hint of voices or footsteps. But all I heard was silence. I don't know how long I stayed there, crouched behind that tree, too scared to move. When I finally felt safe enough to stand up, the woods were completely dark, no sign of the road or the truck. I started walking again, this time in the direction I thought would take me back to the road. It took hours, but eventually, I found my way back. The road was empty, and there was no sign of the truck. I walked until I finally reached the edge of town, the first streetlights just starting to show through the trees. I never saw those men again, never found out what they wanted. I still don't know if they were just messing with me or if it was something worse. But I'll never forget those blank stares, the way they watched me, like they were waiting for something. Since that night, I haven't taken any more late-night drives through the woods. I don't think I ever will again. I was on a long drive for work and needed a place to crash. It was late, almost midnight, when I finally found this rundown motel off the main road. The sign flickered with half-burnt bulbs, and the place looked like it hadn't seen fresh paint in years. But it was the only place around, and I was dead tired. So I pulled in, grabbed my bag, and checked in. The guy at the front desk barely looked up from his paper, handing me the key without much of a word. The room was as bad as the outside. The bedspread looked worn, and there was a faint smell of mildew. But I didn't care. All I wanted was a few hours of sleep before I got back on the road. I tried to get comfortable, but it was hard to relax in that room. The walls were thin, and I could hear the faint sounds of people in other rooms, pipes creaking, and every once in a while, the hum of a car passing outside. I turned off the lights, pulled the covers up, and tried to let the noise fade into the background. Then, just as I was finally starting to drift off, I heard a tapping sound on the window. It was light at first, almost like a gentle knock, and I thought maybe it was just a branch brushing against the glass. But then it came again, more insistent, a steady tap, tap, tap. I told myself to ignore it, that it was probably nothing, but something about it felt wrong. Curiosity got the better of me, and I got up, creeping over to the window. I didn't pull back the curtain right away. I just stood there, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping continued, steady and soft. Finally, I pulled the curtain aside just a bit, enough to see outside. There was a boy standing there, right outside my window, staring in at me. He couldn't have been more than 10 years old, with messy hair and big, dark eyes. He was pale, and his clothes looked old, like they didn't fit him right. He raised his hand and tapped on the glass again, looking at me with this pleading expression. I leaned down to get a better look, and he mouthed something, but I couldn't hear him through the glass. I hesitated, wondering what a kid was doing out here, all alone at this hour. My first thought was that he was lost or hurt. I reached for the latch to open the window, figuring I'd ask him what he was doing there and maybe help him find his parents or call someone. But just as my hand touched the latch, something caught my eye. Behind the boy, just on the edge of the window's view, there was a shadow, a figure, barely visible in the dark. I froze, my fingers still on the latch, as my eyes adjusted to the darkness outside. The figure was tall, too tall to be another kid. They were standing perfectly still, half hidden by the shadow of the building, but I could just make out the outline of their body. I couldn't see a face, just the dark shape of someone watching, waiting. They were positioned just far enough back that you'd miss them if you weren't looking closely. I looked back at the boy, who was still staring at me, still mouthing words I couldn't hear. He seemed to be getting more desperate, gesturing for me to open the window, his small hand pressing flat against the glass. But my eyes kept drifting back to that shadow, that figure lurking in the darkness, barely visible but definitely there. It clicked, all at once. This boy wasn't alone. He was being used, somehow, as bait. I don't know how I knew, but everything in me screamed not to open that window. I pulled my hand away, stepping back, feeling my heart hammer in my chest. The boy's expression changed. He went from pleading to almost angry, his brows knitting together, his mouth pressing into a thin line. He knocked harder on the glass, a steady, insistent knock that seemed louder now, echoing in the quiet room. His eyes never left mine, and it was like he knew I wasn't going to open it. I backed away from the window, my skin crawling. I didn't know what to do. Part of me felt guilty, wondering if maybe I was wrong, if this kid really did need help. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. I glanced around the room, trying to figure out my next move, when I heard a faint creak, like someone stepping on the gravel just outside my door. I held my breath, listening. The sound moved closer, slow and deliberate, like whoever it was wanted me to hear them. Then, there was a soft scrape against the door, followed by a low whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but it was a voice, someone just outside, speaking in a low, calm tone. It was chilling, hearing that voice so close, knowing there was just a thin layer of wood between us. I grabbed my phone, but the signal was weak. I managed to dial 911, but it took ages for the call to go through. When someone finally picked up, I whispered that I needed help, that someone was outside my room, trying to get in. They told me to stay on the line, that they'd send someone, but it would take time. This place was out in the middle of nowhere. As I held the phone, I heard the doorknob rattle, slow at first, then harder, like someone was testing it, seeing if they could turn it. My heart was pounding so loud I thought it would give me away. I pressed myself back against the wall, clutching the phone, just praying they'd leave. The rattle stopped, and for a moment there was silence. I thought maybe they'd gone. But then, there was a soft tap on the window again, lighter this time, like they were testing if I'd respond. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. I just waited, every muscle in my body tense. Eventually, the tapping stopped, and I heard the faint crunch of footsteps moving away from the door. I didn't dare look out the window again. I just sat there, waiting, listening as the sounds faded into the distance. I stayed like that until I saw the red and blue lights flashing through the thin curtains, and I finally felt a wave of relief wash over me. The cops didn't find anyone. They looked around the property, checked the nearby roads, but whoever it was had vanished by the time they got there. They told me it was probably a drifter, someone looking for trouble, and advised me to be more careful about where I stayed in the future. I checked out right then, got in my car, and drove for hours until I found a busy diner where I could sit and gather my thoughts. I don't know who that boy was or what that person outside wanted, but I'm just glad I didn't open that window. I worked the graveyard shift at a 24-hour convenience store, just me, the buzzing lights, and that ticking clock. It was the kind of job where nothing really happened, just quiet hours with the occasional late-night shopper. People would shuffle in, grab a drink or snack, maybe some smokes, then leave. And I was fine with that. I liked the quiet. But then he started showing up. It was sometime in early September. I remember that night because the air felt heavy, like it might rain. He was just standing across the street, right by the old lamppost that flickered on and off. I noticed him, thought maybe he was waiting for a ride or something, but he just stayed there. No movement, no one else around. At first, I tried not to think too much of it. I kept myself busy, stocked the shelves, cleaned the counter, anything to pass the time. But every time I looked up, he was still there, just staring. It's like he was waiting for something. The next night, he was there again, in the same spot, same stance, arms crossed. He was tall, maybe in his late 30s or 40s, with a bit of a scruffy look. He wore a dark jacket and jeans, nothing that really stood out, but the way he watched, it wasn't normal. I could feel it, that prickle on the back of my neck. I kept telling myself maybe he was just some guy who lived nearby, maybe waiting for someone. But he never crossed the street, never came inside. He didn't come every night, just enough that I started to expect it. Sometimes it'd be 2 nights in a row, then he'd skip a day, then back again. It made me uneasy, but I couldn't really do anything about it. He wasn't breaking any laws by just standing there. Then, one night, about a week later, he finally came inside. It was around 2 in the morning. The store was empty, like usual, just me and the hum of the freezers in the back. I was restocking the drink fridge when I heard the bell over the door. I looked up, and there he was, stepping in. He didn't look at me right away, just walked down the first aisle, his hands tucked in his jacket pockets. I tried to act normal, just went back to stocking the shelves, but I could feel him watching me from the corner of his eye as he walked slowly through the store. He wasn't looking at the products or grabbing anything, just lingering, one aisle at a time. I kept telling myself not to freak out, that maybe he was finally here to buy something, that it was all just in my head. But then he turned down my aisle, just a few feet away, and stopped. He looked at me, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. His gaze was intense, like he was looking right through me. "Hi, Claire," he said. I froze. I hadn't told him my name. I was sure of that. I didn't wear a name tag or anything. There was no way he could have known. My mind raced, trying to think if I'd slipped up somehow, but I knew I hadn't. I forced a smile, tried to play it cool. "Can I help you with something?" He didn't answer right away, just kept staring. Then he tilted his head, almost like he was sizing me up. "You're here alone, aren't you?" he said, like he was making small talk, but his voice was low, calm. Too calm. Something about the way he said it made my stomach twist. I didn't want him to know I was alone. I cleared my throat, shrugged. "Not always," I said, hoping it sounded believable. "My manager comes in around 3. He just smiled, a thin, tight smile. "I know you're here alone, Claire," he said, his voice steady, almost amused. I wanted to scream or run, but I forced myself to stay calm. I was in my own store, with cameras watching. I kept my voice even, trying to sound unfazed. "Look, if you don't need anything, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." He took a step closer, too close for comfort, and I could feel my heart racing. "You shouldn't be working here by yourself," he said, like he was giving me advice, like he was concerned for me. "It's dangerous, especially at night." I backed up a little, moving towards the counter where I had a phone under the register. I glanced over at it, hoping he didn't notice, but he did. I could see it in his eyes. He knew exactly what I was thinking. "Don't worry," he said, a bit of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I'm not here to hurt you. Just wanted to see you up close." His words made my skin crawl. I tried to think of what to say, something that would get him to leave, but my mind was blank. All I could do was stare at him, my throat dry, my hands shaking. Finally, he stepped back, giving me a little space, but he didn't turn to leave. "I'll see you around, Claire," he said, like he was making a promise. Then he walked out, as calm as he'd come in, and disappeared into the night. I stood there for a long time, heart pounding, trying to process what had just happened. I didn't know what to do. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That a man came into the store and acted strange? They wouldn't take me seriously. After that, I kept an eye out for him every night, just waiting for him to come back. And he did. Sometimes he'd just stand outside, watching. Other nights, he'd come in, wander around without buying anything, then leave. And every time he'd call me by name, I started dreading my shifts. I didn't feel safe anymore. I tried telling my boss, but he just shrugged it off, said I was overreacting. "People are weird sometimes," he told me, like that was supposed to make me feel better. One night, when I couldn't take it anymore, I confronted him. He'd come in, lingered around as usual, and I just snapped. "Why do you keep coming here?" I asked, my voice shaking. "What do you want?" He looked at me, that same unsettling smile on his face. "I just like seeing you," he said, his voice soft. "I feel like we know each other." "We don't," I said, my voice firm. "Stop coming here." His smile faded, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something else in his eyes. Anger, maybe. He took a step closer, and I could feel the tension in the air. "Careful, Claire," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't want to make me angry." I didn't know what to say, so I just stayed silent, watching as he finally turned and left. That was the last time I saw him. I don't know why he stopped coming after that. Maybe he found someone else to follow, someone else to watch. I quit the job not long after that. I couldn't stay there, not knowing if he'd show up again. Even now, I still look over my shoulder, still feel like he's out there somewhere, watching. I don't think I'll ever feel safe again. I work night shifts as an engineer at this old facility. It's mostly maintenance and monitoring equipment, making sure everything's running smooth, not much action. The place is huge, too, with a lot of rooms, mostly empty. It's quiet, empty, just me and the machines humming all night. I usually didn't mind it. I got used to the silence, the solitude. Then about a week ago, I started hearing this tapping noise in the control room. It was faint, barely there at first. A soft, slow tap tap tap, like a finger drumming on metal or glass. I thought it was maybe a machine vibrating somewhere nearby. The building's old, and noises come with it, so I didn't think too much of it at first. It would start, then stop, then start again, irregularly. It was just enough to put me on edge. By the third night, it was getting under my skin. I'd be sitting there, trying to concentrate on the monitors, and the tapping would come back, just this gentle tap 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 from somewhere behind me. It would echo around the room, bouncing off the walls, hard to pinpoint. Every time I turned around, it'd stop. I'd listen, hold my breath, waiting to catch it again, but it wouldn't start up again until I turned back to my work. One night, it got louder, clear enough that I felt like it was coming from right behind me. I whipped around in my chair, expecting to see something or someone, but there was nothing. Just empty monitors and the big window behind me, looking out over the factory floor. Just blackness outside, and my own reflection in the glass. I'd get up, walk around the room, tap on different surfaces, trying to recreate the sound. I couldn't get it quite right, though. Nothing I tapped on had that same sharp, deliberate rhythm. I started wondering if maybe I was just hearing things, but every time I'd almost convince myself it was in my head, there it'd be again, tap, tap, tap. By the end of the week, I was starting to lose it. I'd barely slept, barely eaten. I was on edge every second, waiting for that sound to start. I'd catch myself staring at the window, feeling like something was looking back at me from the dark. That night, I heard the tapping louder than ever. I spun around, staring out through the glass. I could have sworn I saw movement outside, just the faintest flicker of something moving, right in the shadows near the corner of the room. My heart was pounding, but I tried to play it cool. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out to the factory floor. I shone the light around, sweeping it across every corner, checking behind every stack of equipment, every shadowed spot. Nothing. The whole place was empty, silent, only the faint hum of machinery and the sound of my own breathing. But the feeling that someone had been there lingered. When I went back into the control room, the tapping started up again, clear as ever, like it was mocking me. This time, I went straight for the window, pressed my face up to the glass, peering out into the dark. That's when I realized the tapping wasn't coming from inside the room, it was coming from the other side of the window. I stumbled back, cold running through me. There was no way up to that window from the outside, it was a few stories up. There shouldn't be anyone on the other side. But as I backed up, the tapping started again, louder, like it was following me. I locked myself in the control room for the rest of the shift, feeling watched the whole time. Every now and then, I'd catch a flash of movement from the corner of my eye, just outside the window. I'd turn and see nothing but darkness, the faint outline of my own reflection in the glass, but I knew something was out there, just beyond the edge of the light. When my shift ended, I practically ran out of there, feeling stupid but too freaked out to care. The next night, I was hesitant to even come in, but I convinced myself it was just some weird noise, maybe a loose pipe or something. I'd deal with it. Halfway through my shift, I heard it again, but this time it was louder, and it didn't stop. It was constant, a steady rhythm like someone drumming their fingers, fast and deliberate. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight and stomped outside, determined to prove to myself it was nothing. When I got outside, I scanned the building, checking every window, every corner. Then I saw it, a shadowy figure pressed up against the control room window, their hand flat on the glass. I froze, watching as they slowly turned and looked straight at me. Even in the dark, I could see their eyes, wide and staring, like they'd been waiting for me to notice them. I stumbled back, heart pounding, and the figure moved away from the window, disappearing into the shadows. I ran back inside, locking the doors behind me. I felt like I was going insane, but I couldn't ignore it anymore. There was someone out there, watching me, waiting for me. For the rest of my shift, I stayed in the control room, keeping the door locked and my back to the wall, refusing to go near the windows. The tapping started up again, soft and steady, just on the other side of the glass. I didn't look this time. I didn't want to see that face again, those eyes watching me, waiting. When my shift finally ended, I grabbed my stuff and ran out of there. I haven't been back since. I don't know who or what was out there, but I don't think it's gone. Every time I walk by the building now, I feel eyes on me, like someone's watching from the windows, just waiting for me to come back. I decided to take a solo hiking trip to the Grand Canyon. I'd always wanted to do it on my own, just me and the trail, nothing to bother me. I thought the quiet would be good for clearing my head, just walking at my own pace, feeling like I was the only person for miles. The day I chose was perfect, clear skies, a slight breeze, and only a few people around at the start. The narrow paths didn't bother me much, I was used to them. They cut along the cliffs, sharp turns, steep edges, and sometimes you could barely fit one person. If someone came from the other direction, you'd have to step back and let them by. A couple of hours in, I was deep enough that I stopped seeing anyone. Just me, the dry dirt under my boots, and the endless stretch of cliffs and the canyon below. I was moving along a narrow path, barely wide enough for one person, with a cliff drop on one side and a steep rock wall on the other. That's when I first noticed him. I was at a turn in the path when I saw him a ways behind me, another hiker, just standing still. It's common enough to see others on these trails, but this guy gave me a strange feeling right off. He was standing too still, and even from a distance, I could see him staring. The path was too narrow for him to have passed without me noticing, so he must have come from the same direction as me, but I didn't remember hearing or seeing him. I brushed it off, figuring he'd keep his distance or maybe stop for a break, and kept walking. But then, maybe 5 minutes later, I heard footsteps behind me. They were steady, a bit too close. I picked up my pace, hoping he'd get the hint, but the steps just matched mine. When I slowed, he slowed too. I could feel his eyes on my back. I finally turned around, and there he was, only a few feet away, staring. He was a man in his 30s, plain looking, with dark hair and a worn-out hiking jacket, but it was his eyes that got me. There was something unsettling about the way he looked at me, too intense, like he was sizing me up. I expected him to say something, maybe ask for directions or make small talk, but he just stared. It felt like he was waiting for me to do something. I mumbled a quick hey, nodding slightly, hoping it would break the weirdness, but he didn't respond. Just looked at me, eyes locked on like he didn't even hear me. I turned and kept walking, faster this time, telling myself he'd back off or maybe take a break. The footsteps kept following, steady and close, like he wasn't trying to keep his distance anymore. Every few minutes, I'd glance back, and he'd be there, always the same distance behind, eyes fixed on me, unblinking. The path was so narrow I couldn't just step aside, and there was no room for him to pass without brushing against me. But he never tried to pass, never made a move to overtake me, just followed, his footsteps syncing with mine. After about 20 minutes of this, I was starting to panic. There was no one else around, and I had no signal. The canyon was so quiet that every sound seemed louder, and his footsteps were the only thing I could hear besides my own. I thought about just stopping and confronting him, but something about the way he stared made me nervous. I didn't want to turn my back on him for too long. At one point, I slowed down so much that he had to stop too, and I turned around again. This time, he was close, maybe 3 feet away, staring straight at me with those same cold eyes. I could feel my heart pounding. I tried to keep my voice steady and said, "Are you trying to pass?" He didn't answer. Just kept looking at me like he was studying every move I made. It felt like he was waiting for something specific, and it made my skin crawl. After a moment, he took a single step forward, close enough now that I could see the dirt caked under his fingernails, the frayed edges of his jacket. That was it for me. I turned and started walking as fast as I could without running, hoping to put some distance between us. The path twisted and turned, and I hoped one of the bends would give me enough cover to lose him, but he kept up, his footsteps right behind me, always at the same distance, never closer, but never farther away. I could feel my breath getting shaky. The narrowness of the path felt suffocating. The cliff edge was only a few steps to my left, and the sheer drop was a constant reminder that I couldn't afford any wrong moves. At one point, I thought I could hear him breathing, slow and steady, matching my own. When the trail finally opened up a bit, I stopped again, thinking he'd have to pass me now. But instead, he stopped too, just far enough back to stay in the shadows, barely visible. He didn't say a word. Didn't even look like he was breathing heavy, just staring. I was on edge, my hands shaking. I didn't want to keep going with him behind me, so I tried something desperate. I pretended to take a break, setting down my backpack, and waited to see what he'd do. He just stood there, watching. When I didn't move, he didn't either. It felt like he was testing my patience, seeing how long I'd sit there before getting back up. After what felt like forever, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my bag and started moving again, faster than before, almost at a jog. I didn't care about the path or the view anymore. I just wanted to get to a spot with people around or any place that didn't feel so isolated. Finally, I saw a wider area up ahead, where the path opened up near a small ledge overlooking the canyon. I figured it was my best chance, somewhere I could keep my distance from him, maybe get a good enough view to see if anyone else was nearby. I sped up, practically sprinting, and reached the ledge, dropping my bag again to catch my breath. For a moment, it was quiet. I couldn't hear his footsteps. I dared to hope he finally stopped, maybe given up or gone another way. Then I looked back. He was still there, just at the edge of the narrow path, watching me, his face still blank, like he had no expression, no reaction to anything. He stepped forward, stopping just before the ledge, looking down at the canyon, then back at me. I don't know what possessed me, but I finally yelled, "What do you want?" He didn't say a thing. Just stared, eyes never moving off me. The silence stretched on, his gaze drilling into me, making my skin crawl. I felt trapped, nowhere to go but back down the same narrow path with him behind me. At last, after what felt like forever, he turned. He walked back down the trail, disappearing around the first bend, just like that. I didn't move for a while, just stood there, waiting, expecting him to come back around the corner any second, but he never did. Eventually, I made my way back down, my eyes darting around every turn, my heart pounding until I finally reached the busier trailheads. I've never gone back to the Grand Canyon since. The worst part is, I'll never know what he wanted, but I can still feel his eyes on me, watching, just out of reach. Working the night shift at the warehouse was usually pretty uneventful. Mostly it was me and a couple other guys loading and organizing pallets, getting everything ready for the morning. I liked the job because I could keep to myself, put in my earbuds, and just zone out for a few hours. No bosses, no customers, just a big, cold building and stacks of boxes. I started noticing weird things about 2 weeks into my shift. It was subtle at first. Little things that didn't seem to fit. One night, I was going through my normal routine, moving pallets of boxes to different areas in the warehouse. When I got to one, there was a single piece of paper lying on top of it, just a torn scrap. At first, I didn't think much of it, figuring it was a packing slip or something. But when I picked it up, there were words written on it, scribbled in messy handwriting. It said, "Good night, Alex." That was my name. I just kind of stood there, staring at it. It was late, and we don't get a lot of visitors or workers coming through here, especially at night. The only other person on shift was Eddie, and he was all the way over by the loading docks, nowhere near this section. He'd have no reason to come over here just to leave a note for me. And why would he? I shrugged it off and threw the paper away. Figured someone left it as a joke, or maybe it was left over from the day shift. But when I went back to work the next night, there was another note on the exact same pallet. This one just had my full name, Alex Martin. Seeing my full name written out gave me a chill. Not just Alex this time, but my last name too. I asked Eddie if he was trying to mess with me, but he swore he didn't know anything about it. And honestly, Eddie wasn't the type. He was a quiet guy, always kept to himself, didn't talk much. He seemed as weirded out by it as I was. After that, it kept happening. Not every night, but enough to make me paranoid. A note here, a little scrap of paper there. Sometimes they just have my name, other times a random phrase like "How's your mom?" or "Sleep well." One night, there was one that said, "I see you." At first, I tried ignoring it, but the notes didn't stop. They started getting more personal, like whoever was leaving them knew things about me. I found one that said, "Hope you're doing okay since the breakup." That one hit me hard because I'd just gone through a breakup a few months ago. It wasn't something I talked about with anyone at work, especially not on the night shift. After that, I started feeling uneasy all the time. Every noise made me jump. I started looking over my shoulder constantly, expecting to see someone watching me. But there was never anyone there. Just the quiet warehouse, the stacks of pallets, and the occasional distant hum of machinery. One night, I decided to keep an eye out, to see if I could catch whoever was doing it. I didn't have any idea how they were getting to the pallets without me seeing them. The notes always showed up in sections where I was working alone, areas Eddie had no reason to go near. Around midnight, I went to check one of the pallets where I'd found a note the night before. Sure enough, there was a new one waiting for me. It said, "You shouldn't be here." I felt my stomach drop when I read that. Something about those words felt hostile. Like whoever was leaving the notes was getting angry. I looked around, but there was nothing but shadows. The lights were dim, and the only sound was my own breathing. I was about to turn and go back to the main area when I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate. I whipped around, but no one was there. The sound had come from just around the corner, in the next aisle over. I stood there, frozen, listening. The footsteps stopped, then started again, closer this time. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing through the empty rows. No answer. I took a step back, my heart pounding. The footsteps kept coming, slow and steady, like whoever was there was taking their time, enjoying watching me squirm. I couldn't see anyone, but I could feel someone there, lurking just out of sight. I turned and bolted back to the main area where Eddie was working. He looked at me, confused, as I came stumbling around the corner, out of breath. "Did you hear that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hear what?" Eddie asked, looking genuinely puzzled. I didn't know what to say. It sounded ridiculous to explain that I'd heard footsteps when there was clearly no one else around. I tried to laugh it off, saying it was probably just the building settling. Eddie shrugged and went back to work, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The notes kept coming, getting more personal, like whoever was leaving them knew everything about me. One of them said, "You left the door unlocked last night." Another one said, "Tell your brother to be careful on his way home." That one terrified me because my younger brother had just gotten his driver's license, and he drove home late from his night classes. I started to feel like I was losing my mind. I didn't know if it was some twisted prank, or if someone was actually watching me, following me, somehow knowing every detail of my life. I started double-checking my car, locking my doors, making sure my phone wasn't being tracked. One night, I was working in the same section again, and I saw a new note on a pallet. I didn't want to read it, but I couldn't stop myself. I unfolded it slowly, hands shaking, and read the words. "Tonight's the night." That was it. Just those 3 words, but it felt like a threat. My chest tightened, and I could feel a cold sweat break out on my skin. I shoved the note in my pocket and tried to keep working, but my mind was racing. What did it mean? Was someone actually planning something, or was it just another sick joke? I decided I couldn't do it anymore. I went to the office, grabbed my stuff, and told Eddie I wasn't feeling well. I didn't tell him the truth, didn't tell him about the notes, or the footsteps, or the feeling that someone was out there, watching. He probably wouldn't have believed me anyway. That was my last night at the warehouse. I quit the next day, didn't even go back to pick up my last paycheck. I just didn't feel safe anymore, didn't feel like I could work there without constantly looking over my shoulder. But even now, months later, I still think about those notes, about the footsteps, about the way whoever was behind it seemed to know everything about me. I was sitting there, waiting for the train in the cold, empty station. It was late, past midnight, and there wasn't another soul around except for this one guy across from me. I didn't pay him much attention at first. I was tired, nodding off a bit, just wanting the train to show up so I could get home. But I started to feel something, like someone's eyes on me. I looked up, and there he was, staring right at me. At first, I thought he was just some tired guy, zoning out, maybe looking in my direction by accident. I looked away, shifted in my seat, tried to ignore it. But every time I looked up, he was staring. Not moving, just looking at me. His eyes were wide, intense, and it felt like they were cutting right through me. He didn't blink, didn't shift his weight. Just stared, like he knew me or something, like he was waiting for me to do something. I felt uneasy. It's hard to explain, but there was something wrong about his stare, like it was too focused, too personal. I decided to get up, put a little space between us. So, I walked over to a different bench, closer to where the train was supposed to come. I sat down, took out my phone, tried to look busy, but I could still feel it, that feeling of being watched. And sure enough, a few moments later, I see him out of the corner of my eye. He'd gotten up too. He walked over to my new bench, real slow, like he was taking his time, enjoying it or something. He sat down right next to me, not across, not a couple of seats away. Right next to me, close enough that I could feel him breathing, smell the faint scent of something stale on him, like old cigarettes and sweat. He didn't say anything at first, just sat there, looking forward. I could see him from the corner of my eye, that same intense, unblinking stare. Finally, he leaned over, real close to my ear, and he whispered, "Why did you move?" It sent a chill down my spine. His voice was raspy, quiet, like he didn't want anyone else to hear, even though it was just the two of us. I didn't know what to say, so I just mumbled something about wanting to be closer to the tracks. He smiled, a slow, strange smile that didn't reach his eyes, and then he said, "You shouldn't have moved." I felt my skin prickle, like he was trying to get a reaction out of me. I thought maybe he was drunk or just looking to mess with someone. I turned slightly, trying to look away, hoping he'd take the hint. But he didn't. He leaned closer, like he had something to share, like he knew a secret. He whispered again, barely a breath this time, "You shouldn't be out here alone." It was such a strange thing to say, and it felt like a threat, like he knew something I didn't. I didn't know how to respond, so I just muttered something about how I was fine, how the train was coming soon. I was trying to keep calm, but I could feel my pulse quickening. He didn't say anything else for a while, just kept sitting there, too close, too still. Then, out of nowhere, he started talking again, and this time he was talking about me. "You live over on Oak Street, don't you?" he said, like it was the most casual thing in the world. I froze. Oak Street was where I lived, but I'd never seen this guy before, never even talked to him. My mind raced, trying to figure out how he could know that. I managed to stammer, "How do you know where I live?" But he just laughed, this low, scratchy laugh that didn't sound right. He looked at me, that smile creeping back onto his face, and said, "I know more than that. I know you get home around this time most nights. I know you stop at that little coffee shop on the way. I know you don't like the dark." I felt my heart pound harder, my chest tightening. I didn't know how he knew these things. I hadn't seen him before, hadn't told anyone where I lived or what my routine was. It was like he'd been watching me, keeping track, but why? And for how long? I tried to get up, tried to put some distance between us, but he grabbed my wrist, tight, his fingers digging in like claws. I could feel the roughness of his skin, and his grip was stronger than I expected. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice low, his eyes wide and unblinking, like he was enjoying the fear he could see in me. I need to get something from my bag," I lied, trying to stay calm. He didn't let go, not right away. He stared at me, searching my face, and then finally, he let go, but he didn't move. He just sat there, watching as I stood up, his head tilted slightly, like he was waiting for something. I backed away, slowly, keeping my eyes on him, and moved to another bench, further down the platform. But he didn't stay put for long. A minute later, he was on his feet, walking toward me, that slow, deliberate pace again. He didn't break eye contact, didn't blink. It was like he was trying to make me feel as uncomfortable as possible, like he was enjoying it. He sat down next to me again, close enough that our knees almost touched, and he leaned in, that grin back on his face. "I knew you'd move again," he whispered. "I knew you couldn't stay still." I didn't say anything. I was too scared. My mouth felt dry, and I could feel my hands shaking. I tried to look away, to pretend he wasn't there, but he reached out, grabbing my chin, turning my face toward him. His grip was firm, his fingers cold. He looked into my eyes, and there was something in his gaze, something dark, something wrong. "You know I could follow you," he said softly, his voice almost gentle, but his eyes were full of something sharp, something that felt like it was slicing into me. "I could follow you all the way home, and no one would know. No one would see." I felt a surge of panic. I yanked my face away, scrambling to my feet, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I didn't care about being polite anymore, didn't care if I looked crazy. I just wanted to get away from him. I backed up, moving toward the edge of the platform, closer to where the security cameras were, hoping they'd catch whatever was happening. He didn't follow me this time. He just sat there, smiling, watching me, his head tilted, his eyes never leaving me. I stayed near the cameras, my hands shaking, waiting for the train, praying it would come soon. He didn't move, didn't come any closer, but he kept watching, his smile never fading. Finally, I heard the rumble of the train in the distance. Relief washed over me, and I stepped closer to the edge, ready to get on, ready to put as much distance between me and this man as possible. But just as the train pulled up, he stood up, took a few steps toward me, and said one last thing. "I'll see you soon." The train doors opened, and I practically jumped inside, my heart racing. I didn't look back as the doors closed, didn't look to see if he was still standing there, watching. I just sat down, my hands still shaking, my mind racing. I didn't know who he was, didn't know how he knew so much about me, but I knew I never wanted to see him again. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been serious, that he'd find me again, somehow. I kept the lights on, kept the doors locked, and tried to tell myself it was over. But deep down, I knew he wasn't done with me. Not yet. It was late, maybe close to midnight, and I was walking back to my dorm. The rain had started earlier in the evening, light at first but steady now. I hadn't thought to bring an umbrella because I wasn't planning to be out for long, but I'd gotten caught up at the library. The campus was almost empty, the kind of quiet that made every sound feel louder than it should be. My shoes slapped against the wet pavement, and the rain dripped off my hood, running down my face. I kept my head low, focused on the path ahead. The buildings around me were dark except for a few security lights glowing in the distance. It was the kind of night where you felt like you were the only person alive. But then I heard it. Footsteps, faint at first, somewhere behind me. I slowed down without thinking, trying to figure out if I'd imagined it. The sound stopped too. I waited, staring back down the path, but there was no one there. Just the rain and the empty walkway stretching into the shadows. I shook it off and kept going. Maybe it was an echo. The campus was full of weird acoustics, sound bounced off the buildings in ways that didn't make sense sometimes. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but I couldn't stop listening for it. A minute later, the footsteps came back. They were heavier this time, splashing in the puddles behind me. I stopped walking again, my breath caught in my throat. The sound stopped too, perfectly in time with me. I turned around, scanning the path. The rain made it hard to see far, but the walkway was empty. I didn't even see a shadow moving. My heart was starting to race now, a nervous energy crawling up my spine. I told myself I was being stupid, that it was probably just someone else heading home. But something felt off about it. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, like eyes were on me, even though I couldn't see anyone. I started walking faster, not running but close to it. The rain seemed louder now, the rhythm of it pounding against my hood, drowning out everything else. But the footsteps came again, louder, closer this time. I didn't stop to look back. I didn't want to. I cut across the grass, heading toward the dorms. My shoes slipped on the wet ground, and I almost fell, but I kept moving. The sound of footsteps followed me, still keeping that same rhythm, stopping whenever I slowed. When I finally reached the dorm courtyard, I felt a wave of relief. The lights were on, and there was a faint hum from the vending machines near the entrance. It felt safer, less exposed. I stopped under the overhang to catch my breath and listened. Nothing. No footsteps, no movement, just the rain and the buzz of the lights. I turned toward the building, fumbling in my pocket for my key card. That's when I heard a voice. "You shouldn't walk alone at night." I spun around so fast I almost lost my balance. A man was standing at the edge of the courtyard, half hidden by the shadows of the building behind him. He wasn't tall, maybe average height, but his shoulders were broad, and he was wearing a dark jacket with the hood pulled up. I couldn't see his face clearly, but he was staring right at me. "I've been watching out for you," he said, taking a step closer. I didn't say anything at first. My mouth felt dry, and my heart was hammering in my chest. He took another step forward, slow and deliberate, like he was trying not to scare me off. His hands were in his pockets, but I couldn't tell if he was holding anything. "You looked like you were in a hurry," he said, his tone calm but strange, like he was trying too hard to sound casual. "Thought I'd make sure you got back safe." I tried to think of what to say, but nothing came out. My mind was racing. I didn't know who this guy was or why he'd been following me, but everything about him felt wrong. I took a step back toward the dorm entrance, keeping my eyes on him. "I don't need any help," I finally managed to say. My voice sounded shaky, even to me. He tilted his head, like he didn't believe me. "It's not safe out here. You never know who might be hanging around." The way he said it made my skin crawl. I gripped my key card tighter, glancing toward the door. It was only a few steps away, but he was close enough now that I wasn't sure I could make it without him trying something. "I'm fine," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm going inside now." He didn't move for a moment, just stood there watching me. Then he smiled, or at least I think he did. It was hard to tell with the rain and the shadows. "You should be more careful," he said, his tone colder now. "Not everyone's as nice as me." That was it. I turned and swiped my key card, shoving the door open with more force than I meant to. The lock clicked behind me as I stepped inside, and I pressed my back against the door, breathing hard. Through the glass, I could see him standing there, still watching me. He didn't move, didn't try to follow me, just stood there in the rain, staring. After what felt like forever, he turned and walked back the way he'd come, disappearing into the shadows. I stayed by the door for a long time, waiting to see if he'd come back. He didn't, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't far away. That night, I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard those footsteps, the way they stopped whenever I did. The next day, I told campus security, but they didn't seem too concerned. They said they'd keep an eye out, but I could tell they didn't think it was a big deal. I don't walk alone at night anymore. Even in the rain, even when the campus feels empty, I always make sure someone knows where I am. Because I can't stop thinking about that man, about what he might have done if I hadn't made it inside. When we moved into the cottage, it felt like the kind of place where we could finally breathe. It wasn't big, 2 bedrooms, a creaky wooden porch, a garden overrun with weeds, but it had charm. Emily and I wanted to leave the city behind, and this seemed like the perfect spot. It sat at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by trees, with no neighbors close enough to hear or bother us. The air was quiet, except for birds and the wind. For the first time in years, we felt like things were going to be okay. The first time we saw him was maybe 3 days after moving in. I was unpacking boxes in the living room while Emily worked in the kitchen. Through the window above the sink, she noticed him standing near the garden. She called me over quietly, like she wasn't sure if she should be worried. The man was old, thin and hunched, wearing a weathered jacket that looked like it had seen more winters than he had. His face was rough, lined with deep wrinkles, and he wore a brown cap pulled low over his head. He was just standing there, staring at the house. At first, I thought he might have wandered in off the road, but the way he stood, it wasn't casual. It was like he knew the place. I stepped out onto the porch, calling out to him. He didn't answer right away, just turned slowly to look at me. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep and gravelly, like he hadn't used it in a while. "I lived here once," he said. "This is my home." I didn't know how to respond. I told him we'd just bought the place from the real estate company, and if he'd lived here before, it must have been years ago. He didn't argue or explain, just nodded and said, "I'll be back tomorrow." Then he walked away. Not down the gravel road or toward the woods, but around the side of the house, disappearing through the trees. Emily and I didn't know what to make of it. She asked if we should call someone, maybe the police or a local outreach program, but he hadn't done anything threatening. It was strange, sure, but we figured he was just some old man with nowhere else to go, clinging to memories of his past. The next morning, I found him sitting on the edge of the garden, picking at the weeds. He didn't look up when I walked out, just kept working like he belonged there. When I asked what he was doing, he said he was keeping the place tidy. I told him he couldn't be on the property without our permission, but he barely reacted. He just muttered, "I've been here longer than you," and went back to pulling weeds. That day, I called the real estate company, asking if they knew anything about the previous owners. They told me the cottage had been vacant for nearly a decade before we bought it. The last person on record was an older woman who'd passed away years ago. There was no mention of anyone else living there. That night, Emily and I double-checked the locks on all the doors and windows before going to bed. We didn't see the old man for the rest of the day, but it felt like he was still there somehow. I couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd said, "This is my home," like it wasn't up for debate. The next few days, he kept showing up. Sometimes, we'd find him sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the garden. Other times, he'd be in the yard, pacing slowly like he was looking for something. Every time I confronted him, he said the same thing, "I lived here once. This is my home." It was starting to wear on us. Emily was nervous about leaving the house when I wasn't there, and I was losing sleep, worried he'd try to come inside. One evening, after he'd left, I decided to search the garden. I thought maybe he was looking for something he'd buried there, some keepsake or piece of his past he couldn't let go of. I dug through the soil in a few places but didn't find anything except roots and rocks. Still, the way he lingered around the garden made it feel like there was something we were missing. That night, I woke up to the sound of the porch creaking. I got out of bed quietly, grabbed the flashlight we kept by the nightstand, and crept to the front door. When I looked out through the peephole, he was standing there, just inches from the door. He wasn't knocking or trying to get in, just standing, staring at the wood like he could see through it. I didn't open the door. I didn't say anything. I just stood there, holding my breath, waiting for him to leave. Eventually, he stepped off the porch and disappeared into the dark. The next morning, I called the police. 2 officers came out and took a statement, but there wasn't much they could do. He hadn't damaged anything or tried to break in, and they couldn't arrest someone for trespassing unless they caught him in the act. They said they patrol the area more often, but I could tell they didn't think it was a big deal. Just an old man, they said. Probably confused. That afternoon, Emily found something in the garden. She was pulling weeds near the back fence when she uncovered a small wooden box, buried just under the surface. Inside was a photograph, faded and yellowed with age. It showed a younger version of the old man, standing in front of the cottage with a woman and a little boy. They were smiling, but there was something off about the picture. The way they stood, the way their smiles didn't quite reach their eyes, it made my skin crawl. That evening, when he showed up again, I confronted him with the photo. I asked him who the people were, thinking maybe it would make him open up or explain himself. Instead, he just looked at it for a long time, then handed it back without a word. He turned and walked away, leaving me standing there with more questions than answers. The last time I saw him was 2 nights later. I woke up to the sound of the back door rattling, like someone was trying to open it. I grabbed the flashlight and went to the kitchen, my heart pounding. Through the window, I saw him standing in the garden, holding the wooden box in his hands. He wasn't looking at me or the house this time, he was looking at the box, almost like he was saying goodbye. I watched as he set the box down in the garden, then turned and walked into the woods. He didn't come back after that. Emily and I decided to move a few months later. We never told the new buyers about the old man. Sometimes, I wonder if he's still out there, sitting in the garden, waiting for someone to bring him home. It was late January, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones no matter how many layers you have on. My son, Tyler, was inside playing with his Legos, and I was outside shoveling the driveway. We'd gotten almost a foot of snow overnight, and it was still coming down in thick, heavy flakes. It wasn't the best time to do it, but if I didn't keep up with it, the whole driveway would be impossible to clear by morning. It was just me and Tyler. His dad left before he was born, so it's always been the two of us. We lived in a quiet neighborhood, mostly older folks, the kind who wave when they see you but don't talk much beyond that. I liked it. It felt safe. That day, though, something felt off. I noticed it when I was halfway through shoveling. A car drove by slowly, so slow that I thought they might stop and ask for directions or something. It was an older sedan, dark blue, with windows so tinted I couldn't see inside. But they didn't stop. They just crawled past and then kept going down the block. I didn't think much of it at first. People drive slow in the snow, right? It's normal. But then, a few minutes later, the same car came back. It was unmistakable, the same deep tint, the same sluggish pace. This time, they slowed even more as they passed my house. I felt their headlights on me as I kept shoveling, trying not to look like I noticed. When they turned the corner again, my stomach twisted. I thought maybe I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me. I stood there for a minute, leaning on the shovel, just staring at the street. The snow was coming down harder now, muffling everything. It was so quiet I could hear my own breathing. A few minutes passed, and the car didn't come back. I told myself to get a grip and went back to shoveling. But then I heard the crunch of tires on snow, faint but unmistakable. I looked up, and there it was again, the same car. It was coming from the other direction this time, creeping along like they were looking for something or someone. I don't know what it was, but something about the way they moved, so deliberate and slow, made my skin crawl. They didn't stop, but they didn't speed up either. They just kept going, disappearing around the bend at the end of the street. I dropped the shovel and went inside, locking the door behind me. Tyler looked up from the living room, his little face lighting up when he saw me. "Mom, are you done?" he asked, holding up a Lego tower he'd been working on. "Not yet, sweetie," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm just taking a break." I went to the front window and pulled the curtain back, just enough to see out. The street was empty, covered in fresh snow. No car, no movement, nothing. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd imagined it, or that it wasn't as strange as it seemed. Maybe they were just lost, I told myself. Maybe they were looking for an address. But then the car came back. I saw it before I heard it this time, the dark shape emerging from the snowfall. They slowed down as they passed my house again, the tires crunching against the snowpack. My heart was pounding so hard I thought Tyler might hear it. I let the curtain drop and backed away from the window. My phone was in the kitchen, so I grabbed it and dialed 911, my hands shaking. I told the dispatcher what was happening, trying to keep my voice calm, but I must have sounded scared because she kept telling me to stay on the line. She said she'd send a patrol car to check the area. While I was on the phone, I heard the sound again. The car was outside, idling this time. I peeked out the window just enough to see the headlights cutting through the falling snow. They were parked right in front of my driveway, the engine running. My whole body went cold. The dispatcher asked me if I could see the driver, but I couldn't. The windows were too dark. I told her they weren't getting out of the car, just sitting there. She told me to stay inside, lock all the doors, and wait for the police. I hung up and grabbed Tyler, pulling him into the kitchen with me. "Mom, what's wrong?" he asked, his voice small and worried. "Nothing, sweetie," I said, forcing a smile. "We're just going to stay in here for a little bit, okay?" I heard the engine rev, and when I peeked out again, the car was gone. The street was empty. I stayed by the window, watching, until I saw the red and blue lights of the patrol car coming down the block. I ran outside, waving them down. The officer was a young guy, probably in his 20s. I told him everything, about how the car had been circling and how it stopped in front of my house. He nodded, taking notes, and said he'd drive around to see if he could spot them. He gave me his card and told me to call if they came back. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard the sound of tires on snow, that slow, deliberate crunch. But the car didn't come back, and by morning, I started to believe it was over. 2 days later, I found footprints in the snow outside my living room window. They weren't mine, and they weren't Tyler's. They led from the sidewalk to the window, stopped there, and then turned back toward the street. I called the police again, but by the time they arrived, the snow had started to melt, and the tracks were fading. That was the last straw. I packed up Tyler and we stayed with my sister for a week. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever was in that car had been watching us, and I didn't want to stick around to find out why. When we came back, I had a security system installed, cameras and everything. I never saw the car again, but sometimes, late at night, I think I hear that sound, the slow crunch of tires on snow. It's probably just my imagination, but I always check the window, just in case. It happened during my first semester at university. I was still trying to get used to living in a city, especially at night. Where I grew up, the streets were quiet, and everyone knew everyone. Here, it was all unfamiliar, big streets, bright lights, and shadows that felt like they could hide anything. It was late, almost midnight, and I had stayed in the library longer than I planned. The bus stop near campus was a 5-minute walk from the library, and I thought I'd be fine. The streets around campus were usually busy, even at night, but that night it felt too quiet. The air was cold, and my breath came out in clouds as I walked. When I got to the stop, there was no one else around. The streetlight above flickered a little, and the shadows it cast seemed to jump every time it did. I checked my phone 12 minutes until the next bus. I sighed and pulled my coat tighter around me, trying to ignore how empty everything felt. I heard footsteps before I saw him. They were faint at first, like he was trying not to be noticed, but as they got closer, they became louder and steadier. I glanced around and spotted him on the other side of the street. He was tall, maybe 6 feet or more, wearing a dark jacket and jeans. His hood was up, and I couldn't see his face clearly. He wasn't walking in a straight line. Instead, he kept pacing, moving a few steps one way, then back the other, his head turning like he was looking for something or someone. I tried not to stare. I looked down at my phone, pretending to check something, but I kept him in my peripheral vision. He crossed the street slowly, almost like he was in no hurry, and started walking toward the bus stop. My stomach tightened. I told myself he was probably just waiting for the bus too. Nothing to worry about. "Hey," he said when he got close. His voice was rough, like he hadn't spoken much that day. "You got any change?" I shook my head. "Sorry, I don't." He took another step toward me, close enough that I could smell the alcohol on his breath. "Come on, you don't have anything? Not even a couple bucks?" "I don't carry cash," I said, my voice quieter than I wanted it to be. He frowned, his eyes narrowing as he looked me up and down. "What about your phone? That's worth something." My chest tightened. I stepped back, glancing down the street, hoping to see the bus coming. It wasn't. "I need my phone," I said, trying to sound firm, but my voice wavered. He stepped closer, closing the distance I just put between us. "What about your bag? You got something in there, right? Don't lie to me." I held onto my backpack tightly, my heart pounding in my ears. "It's just books," I said. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. It was sharp and cold. "Books, huh? Let me see." I took another step back, but there was nowhere to go. The bus stop was right behind me. My hands were shaking, and I could feel my legs getting weaker. I wanted to run, but he was blocking the way. He noticed me looking past him and stepped to the side, cutting off any chance I had to slip around him. "Don't make this hard," he said. His voice was lower now, almost a growl. "I'm not asking for much." "I don't have anything," I said again, but my voice cracked. My eyes darted around, looking for anyone who might be nearby, anyone who could help. The street was empty. He leaned in, and I could feel the heat from his breath. "You think I'm stupid? I know you've got something. Just give it to me, and I'll leave you alone." I could feel tears stinging my eyes, but I forced them back. Crying wouldn't help. I looked at his face for the first time. His eyes were bloodshot, and there was a twitch in his jaw, like he was barely holding something back. He wasn't just angry. He was desperate. A car drove past, its headlights sweeping over us for a second before it kept going. I thought about yelling, waving my arms, but the car was already too far away. He didn't even look at it. His focus was entirely on me. He reached for my bag. "Come on, let's see what you've got in here." I jerked back instinctively, holding onto the straps. "No!" The word came out louder than I intended, echoing in the empty street. His expression changed. The anger I'd seen in his eyes before flared, and he grabbed my arm, his grip tight and painful. "Don't raise your voice at me," he said through clenched teeth. I twisted, trying to pull away, but he was strong. "Let go of me," I shouted, hoping anyone might hear. He shoved me against the glass panel of the bus stop, and I hit it hard enough to make the whole thing rattle. My head spun for a second, but I didn't stop struggling. I kicked out, my foot connecting with his shin, and he let go just enough for me to slip out of his grip. I stumbled into the street, barely keeping my balance. He came after me, his face twisted in fury. "You think you can just walk away?" he yelled. I ran. I didn't look back, didn't care about the bus or my bag or anything else. My only thought was to get away. My legs burned as I sprinted down the street, my breath coming in short, panic gasps. I heard his footsteps behind me, heavy and fast. He was chasing me. I pushed myself harder, my heart pounding so loud I couldn't hear anything else. I turned a corner and spotted a convenience store up ahead, its lights still on. Without thinking, I ran straight for it. I burst through the door, nearly crashing into a display of snacks. The cashier looked up, startled. "Call the police." I shouted, my voice hoarse. "There's a man, he's chasing me." The cashier grabbed the phone, and I turned to look at the door. The man had stopped just outside, standing in the glow of the streetlights. He was staring at me, his chest heaving like he'd been running too. For a moment, he just stood there, and I thought maybe he was going to come in. But then he turned and walked away. The police arrived a few minutes later. I told them everything, gave them a description, but they said there wasn't much they could do unless they caught him in the act. They offered to drive me back to campus, and I accepted. My legs were still shaking too much to walk. I never saw him again, but I stopped taking the late bus after that. It's been months, and I still can't stand waiting alone at a bus stop. Every time I hear footsteps behind me, I freeze, expecting to see him there. I never thought my hobby would put me in a situation like that. Wildlife photography had always been a way for me to disconnect, something I could lose myself in. There's something peaceful about just observing animals in their natural habitat, no interruptions, no noise. I would spend hours in the woods, hiking, waiting, just trying to catch a glimpse of something beautiful through the lens. Most of the time, I come back empty-handed, but every now and then, I get the shot I was hoping for. That was enough for me. This all started in the fall, just before the weather started to change. The leaves were turning color, and the air had that crisp bite to it. I'd been out in the woods for a couple of hours, deep into the forest, hoping to capture some shots of deer. There were rumors in town about a large buck being seen near the creek, and I figured if I just waited long enough, I'd get a photo of it. It was supposed to be a quiet afternoon. I had my camera, a tripod, and a couple of lenses, all set up near the creek where I thought the buck might show up. I had no plans of going far. The creek was about a mile into the forest, a well-known spot for wildlife. Everything was peaceful. The only sounds were the rustling of the wind through the trees and the occasional chirp of a bird. I was scanning the area through my lens, hoping to catch a glimpse of the animal. And then I heard something. A sound that didn't belong. It wasn't the usual forest noise. It was too heavy, too deliberate. The sound of something or someone walking, crunching through the underbrush in a way that wasn't quite right. I lowered the camera, listening carefully. At first, I thought it was just another hiker, maybe a hunter or someone out for a walk, but the noise was too methodical. They weren't trying to be discreet, like a hiker would. I could hear the heavy steps getting closer, and it made my heart start to race. I crouched down behind some trees, trying to stay out of sight, praying it wasn't someone coming to ruin my spot. I waited, hoping whoever it was would just move on. But then I saw him. At first, it was just a shadow, but then he stepped into the clearing, a man in camouflage gear, carrying a large rifle slung over his shoulder. I froze. I thought about getting up and leaving, but I knew it was too late for that. He had already seen me. I had no idea who he was, but I knew that he didn't belong there. He wasn't hiking, and he definitely wasn't here for the same reason I was. He moved with the confidence of someone who knew the woods well, too well. He wasn't just out for a walk, he was hunting. That much was obvious. But as I watched him, something else caught my attention. Behind him, another man appeared. He wasn't as close, but he was coming, moving through the trees. The two of them were on a mission. I couldn't stay there any longer. I needed to get out of sight. I grabbed my camera and tripod as quietly as I could and started moving. I kept low, making sure not to break any branches, trying to make as little noise as possible. But my heart was pounding in my chest. I didn't know if they had seen me, but I had no way of knowing if they were hunting for something or someone. I was hoping I could just disappear into the forest and get back to my car, but I wasn't taking any chances. I needed to leave, fast. I hadn't made it more than a few yards when I heard the crack of a branch snapping behind me. They'd spotted me. My breath caught in my throat, and my legs almost gave out. I wanted to turn around and run, but I didn't know how far they were, how much time I had before they closed in. I slowed down, trying to listen, trying to get a feel for where they were. But I couldn't hear anything. It was all so quiet, and then I heard something else. A voice, low and harsh, just a few yards away. "Did you see him?" I froze. My heart seemed to stop beating for a moment. My body went cold. I could barely breathe, trying to stay as still as possible. I hadn't been quiet enough. "You think he saw us?" The second voice was more distant, but still, it was close enough that I could hear it clearly. The first man didn't answer right away, and I held my breath, hoping they would just move on. But instead, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming closer. "He was here," the first man said. "I'm not letting him get away." The panic hit me like a freight train. I started moving again, faster this time, desperate to get out of sight. I didn't care where I went. I just needed to get away from them. They were hunters, and they didn't know me. But they knew I was there, and if they thought I was a witness, if they thought I'd seen something I shouldn't have, I was in real trouble. I started running. Not far, not fast, but fast enough to put some distance between us. I was barely keeping it together, my thoughts scattered, but I knew one thing. I needed to get back to my car. The woods seemed endless, the trees closed in, the ground uneven and unforgiving. I tripped a few times, the camera swinging on my neck as I ran, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I didn't know how much time had passed, but I was starting to feel dizzy. My chest burned, and I felt my legs begin to give out. I couldn't keep this up for long. But then I saw it, a small clearing, just up ahead. And at the edge of the clearing, the flickering light of my car. I was so close, but I couldn't make it. The sound of footsteps, heavy, quick, was close behind me now. They were getting closer. I could hear the men yelling to each other, their voices growing louder. "Get him," one of them shouted. I turned and made a desperate dash for the clearing. My breath came in ragged gasps, and the trees whipped by me as I ran. I could hear the sound of them chasing me. One of them was right on my heels. I didn't dare look back. I kept my eyes fixed on the car, praying I would make it. I was almost there when I heard a sharp crack, like a branch snapping. Then another noise, a sound I couldn't place, but it didn't matter. I was almost at the clearing. I could see the open space where the car was parked. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. I burst through the last of the brush, stumbling out into the open. My car was right in front of me, and I could see it clearly now. My keys were in my pocket, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get them out. I fumbled with the door handle, hearing the footsteps close in, but just as my hand landed on the door, I managed to yank it open and get inside. I slammed the door shut, locking it as fast as I could, and cranked the engine. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the wheel. I didn't look back. I just drove. Fast. I don't know how long I drove, but I didn't stop until I was safely out of the woods, back on the main road. My heart was still pounding in my chest, my hands still shaking, but I was alive. I made it out. But I haven't been back into those woods since. And I don't think I ever will. The snow started falling the night I arrived at the rental. It was supposed to be a quiet week for me, just a break from everything. I'd booked the place because it was secluded, with nothing around but trees and a wide stretch of empty land. I thought the isolation would be peaceful, maybe even refreshing. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the snow was already coming down heavily, and the air had that dense, muffled quality that comes with a storm. The house itself was small but comfortable, with big windows that looked out over the yard and a fireplace in the living room. I spent the first evening unpacking, settling in, and listening to the wind pick up outside. By the time I went to bed, the snow had piled up enough to cover the lower half of the porch railing. The next morning, I was surprised to find the driveway completely cleared. It had snowed most of the night, and when I'd gone to bed, the driveway was buried. But now, it was clean, with neat lines of shoveled snow pushed to either side. I hadn't even heard anyone outside. It struck me as odd, but I figured maybe it was a neighbor being kind. I hadn't seen any other houses nearby on the way in, but maybe there was someone farther down the road. I made a mental note to thank whoever it was if I met them. That day passed quietly. I stayed inside, reading by the fire and watching the snow come down. It didn't stop for hours, and by the time I went to bed, the wind was howling so loud that it drowned out everything else. I remember lying awake for a while, thinking about how heavy the storm was getting. Eventually, I fell asleep. The next morning, it was the same thing. The driveway was shoveled, and the snow pushed neatly to the sides. This time, I felt uneasy. It had snowed even harder during the night, and I hadn't heard anything, no scraping of a shovel, no crunching footsteps in the snow. I checked the windows, looking for tracks, but the driveway was the only thing disturbed. The yard, the porch, everything else was untouched. I tried to brush it off, but it stayed with me all day. Every time I looked out the window, I expected to see someone. I didn't, though. The yard was empty, the trees were still, and the snow kept falling. That night, I decided to stay up and keep an eye on things. I turned off all the lights, sat by the window in the living room, and watched the driveway. It was almost 3 in the morning when I saw movement. A figure stepped out of the tree line at the edge of the yard, carrying a shovel. I froze, watching as they made their way to the driveway and started shoveling. They were methodical, moving in straight lines and tossing the snow aside with quick, practiced movements. I couldn't see much detail in the dark, but they were wearing a heavy coat with the hood pulled up. I thought about opening the door and calling out, but something stopped me. The way they moved, it was too precise, too mechanical. They didn't stop to rest or look around, just kept shoveling until the driveway was clear. Then they turned and walked back toward the trees, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't sleep at all after that. I stayed by the window until the sun came up, watching the yard. The wind had calmed, and the snow had stopped falling. Everything was eerily still. It wasn't until mid-morning that I noticed the footprints. They started at the tree line, led to the driveway, and then back again. But there were no other prints, no sign of where they'd come from or gone to beyond the trees. It was as if they just appeared out of nowhere. That afternoon, I called the rental company. I asked if they knew of anyone nearby who might be clearing the driveway, but they said the property was isolated. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and they didn't provide any snow removal services. I hung up feeling unsettled. That night, I kept all the lights on. I locked the doors, checked the windows, and sat in the living room with a kitchen knife in my lap. I kept telling myself that it was just a neighbor being helpful, that there was nothing to worry about. But when I thought about the way they'd moved, the way they'd disappeared into the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke up to a strange sound. It was faint at first, like a soft scraping, but it grew louder. I realized it was coming from the front of the house. Heart pounding, I crept to the window and looked out. The figure was back, shoveling the driveway again. This time, I could see them more clearly in the glow of the porch light. Their coat was bulky and patched in places, and their movements were just as precise as before. I stayed frozen, watching them work. When they finished, they didn't go back to the trees. Instead, they stopped at the edge of the yard and turned toward the house. For a long moment, they just stood there, staring at the windows. I couldn't see their face, but I could feel their eyes on me. My breath caught in my throat, and I ducked down, trying to stay out of sight. When I dared to peek again, they were gone. The next morning, I found something on the porch. It was a small pile of snow, shaped into a crude figure. It looked like a person, with stick arms and a lump for a head. It hadn't been there the night before. I didn't know what to do. I felt like I was being watched, like whoever it was wanted me to know they'd been there. I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed my things and loaded the car, keeping an eye on the trees the whole time. As I was pulling out of the driveway, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the figure standing at the edge of the yard, just watching me. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town. I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but I can't stop thinking about the way they stood there, motionless, as I drove away. I'll never go back to that cabin. I don't even like to think about it. I've been working as a geologist for a few years now, and when I first started this project, I didn't think it would lead to anything unusual. I was tasked with mapping out some rock formations in a remote part of the desert, an area where few people ventured. The heat was intense during the day, but the work itself was easy enough. A lot of long hours in the sun, measuring rock samples, and taking photos. It was quiet out there, just the occasional rattlesnake or lizard, and I didn't mind it at all. The spot where I was working was hours away from the nearest town, so I would camp out in my truck, usually setting up for a couple of days at a time. I had some equipment set up near a small wash where I'd been taking samples, and I'd usually just drive to and from the site when I needed to get supplies. The isolation was both peaceful and unsettling, but I had no reason to be afraid. That is, until the night it happened. It was late, maybe around 11 p.m. I had finished my day of work and was heading back to camp when I noticed something odd. Off in the distance, far past the area where I'd been collecting samples, I saw a faint light. At first, I thought it was just a car or maybe someone else working in the area, but it was too still. I'd seen cars pass by this stretch of desert before, but they were few and far between, and this was different. This light was stationary. I pulled over to the side of the dirt road, shutting off my engine to listen. It was so quiet out there, you could hear a pin drop. The light seemed to come from behind a small hill that was just outside my usual work zone. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was a group of campers or someone else doing some kind of work out there, but the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt. It didn't make sense that anyone would be out there at this hour, especially so far away from any marked roads. After a few minutes, I decided to drive closer. It wasn't like me to go poking around in places I didn't need to be, but I couldn't shake the curiosity. I had a feeling in my gut that I couldn't explain. Maybe I just wanted to know what it was, or maybe it was the isolation making my mind wander. I started the truck back up and crept forward slowly, keeping the headlights off as much as I could. The closer I got, the more I could make out. There were figures. People, a few of them, standing near the light. It was a campfire, I thought at first. But no! As I got closer, I could see that there were no tents, no camp chairs. They were digging in the sand with shovels. I couldn't make out much more than that, but I could tell that they were burying something, and it looked deliberate. It didn't look like something you'd do to set up camp, it looked like they were hiding something. I felt my heart race, but I couldn't turn back now. I had to know what was going on. I drove a little closer, keeping a good distance between my truck and their location. The headlights were off, and I tried to stay as quiet as possible. But as I slowly crept forward, my truck's tires shifted on the gravel, and I knew they heard it. One of the people turned around, their silhouette just visible in the dim light. They froze, then began walking toward where I was. I immediately panicked. I should have turned around, driven back to the main road, and just left. But I didn't. I stayed there, frozen, and watched as the person came closer. My mind was racing, my hand hovering over the gear shift. I was debating whether to drive off or just stay still. It felt like an eternity, but in reality, it was only a few seconds before the figure reached the edge of the light. I could see them more clearly now. He was tall, wearing a long-sleeved shirt and a hat. He had a shovel in his hand. He stopped, just standing there, staring at me. I could feel the tension in the air. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just sit there forever, so I decided to drive away, slowly at first, just trying to ease my truck back without making a sound. But I couldn't get far before I heard another figure shouting. Hey! Hey! What the hell are you doing? That's when I knew I'd been seen. I didn't know what I was getting myself into, but I knew I had to leave. I floored the gas pedal, tearing back toward the road, the truck bumping over the rough desert terrain. In the rearview mirror, I could see the light growing dimmer, but I could also make out figures moving toward me, running. I didn't dare look for too long, I couldn't risk it. I pushed my truck harder, trying to reach the safety of the main road, but the fear gnawed at me. What were they hiding? What were they burying out there in the desert, so far from civilization? I didn't have answers, and I didn't care to find out. All I wanted was to get back to the main road and get to a place where I wasn't alone, where I could feel safe. As I finally reached the main road, I felt a little better, but I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I drove straight through the night, not once looking back. The whole time, my heart was pounding in my chest. My hands were trembling, gripping the wheel so hard I thought my knuckles would snap. The desert felt bigger now, more dangerous than it ever had before. The thought of those people, what they were doing, stayed with me the entire drive back. The next day, I told my supervisor what had happened. I left out the details of the burial, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. The way they looked at me, the urgency in their movements, it felt like something was very wrong. But when I mentioned it to anyone who might have known something about the area, I was met with blank stares. No one knew anything about illegal activity or people digging around the desert at night. People said it was probably just some folks camping out or maybe miners looking for something. But I didn't buy it. I didn't go back to that site. I don't think I ever will. I don't care how much research I have left to do. If I'm being honest, I still think about those people every time I work out there. The thought of them out in that vast, empty desert, burying something, makes me feel like I'm being watched. The desert has a way of making you feel small and insignificant, like you're just a speck in an endless stretch of nothingness. But this time, I felt like I wasn't alone. It started about 2 weeks after I moved into the house. I had been living alone in this quiet little cottage on the outskirts of town. The house was charming, small, but with a lot of character. The kind of place that felt peaceful, nestled between a dense forest and a field that stretched for miles. I thought it would be a perfect spot for me to start fresh. At first, everything was fine. I'd spend my days getting used to the place, setting up my furniture, and organizing the boxes that seemed to multiply no matter how much I unpacked. The house had large windows, which I loved, especially in the mornings when the sunlight would pour in. There was a sense of calm, of serenity, in those early days. But then, something started to feel off. It was the first time I noticed the footprints. I had just woken up one morning, made coffee, and was standing by the window in my kitchen, staring out at the woods. I don't know why, but I had this nagging feeling, something I couldn't shake. I noticed the grass near the edge of the trees looked disturbed, like someone had been walking there recently. It was still early, and the grass was damp from the dew. I thought nothing of it at first, maybe an animal had passed through. But when I looked closer, I saw human-sized footprints. Big ones, the kind you only notice if you're really looking. They were fresh, still visible despite the morning fog. They were right outside my window, leading toward the trees. I felt a chill run through me, but I brushed it off. It wasn't that unusual for someone to be walking near the woods. Maybe it was a neighbor or just someone passing by. I tried to rationalize it, but I couldn't stop thinking about it the rest of the day. The next morning, I woke up early again. It had rained the night before, so when I looked out the window, the footprints were still there, now clearer than before. They came up to the window, stopped for a moment, then turned and disappeared into the woods. I felt a knot in my stomach. I tried to tell myself I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. That afternoon, I went to the local store and mentioned it to the cashier, an older woman who had been living in the area for years. She looked at me strangely and said, "You should be careful. People don't come around here much. If you see footprints by your windows again, maybe think about locking your doors." It was a strange thing to say, and I felt my skin crawl. But I figured she was just being protective, like small-town people often are. So, I ignored it and moved on. The next few days, the footprints kept showing up. Every morning, without fail. Always near the windows, always leading into the woods. I began to feel like I was losing my mind. I hadn't seen anyone near the house, but I couldn't deny the marks outside. The footprints seemed to change slightly each day, like the person was trying to be more careful, but still left enough evidence that I couldn't ignore it. I started keeping the blinds closed at night, but that didn't help. Every morning, I still found the prints. I started sleeping with the lights on, just in case, but I didn't sleep well. It felt like someone was always near, watching me. It was on the 5th day that I saw him. I had just finished dinner and was cleaning up in the kitchen when I heard a sound from outside. A faint rustling, like someone moving through the underbrush. My heart stopped. I stood completely still, straining to hear. The sound stopped, then started again, but this time it was closer. I peeked through the blinds and saw him. A man, standing just outside my window. He was barely visible, partially hidden by the trees, but I could see enough to know it was him. I could barely breathe. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket, and his face was half hidden in shadow. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there, staring at the house. He didn't move for what felt like hours, though I'm sure it was only minutes. My heart raced as I stood frozen in place, not daring to make a sound. Eventually, he turned and walked away. The footsteps that had been so familiar to me now felt like a nightmare. I don't know how I managed to sleep that night, but I did. I was scared, terrified, really, but somehow I managed to get a few hours of rest. The next day, I didn't leave the house. I called the police, but they didn't seem to take me seriously. They told me that it was likely someone just passing by, maybe a hunter or a hiker. They told me to lock the doors and keep an eye out, but they didn't offer much else. I wanted to tell them about the footprints, but I didn't know how to explain it without sounding crazy. That night, I heard him again. This time, he wasn't just standing outside. I heard him move around the side of the house. The scraping of his shoes against the gravel. It was slow, deliberate. I felt the terror flood my body, like ice running through my veins. I grabbed my phone, tried to call the police again, but the line went dead. I was alone. I spent what felt like hours sitting in the dark, not moving, listening to the noises. There was nothing I could do. My mind raced with thoughts of what he might do, why he was there. I couldn't sleep that night. I couldn't stay in that house anymore. I packed a bag and drove to a hotel. I didn't even care about the cost. I just needed to get away. But when I returned the next day, I knew something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones. I walked to the window, and sure enough, there they were, the footprints. But this time, they were inside the house. Near the back door, just by the kitchen. I don't know how it happened. I don't know when he got inside. I don't know if he had been in the house while I was sleeping or if I had missed something. All I knew was that I wasn't safe there anymore. I never went back to that house. I moved into a new place in the city, far from those woods, far from the strange, terrifying presence that had invaded my life. But even now, years later, when I'm alone and it's too quiet, I think about those footsteps. The man standing at the window. And I wonder if he's still out there, watching, waiting. It had been raining since late afternoon, the kind that doesn't let up, where the streets shine under the lights, and everything feels heavier. The convenience store was quiet that evening, quieter than usual. People didn't want to venture out in weather like that, so it was just me and the hum of the refrigerators in the back. The clock was creeping toward 10, time to lock up for the night. I'd already wiped down the counter and stocked the shelves during the lulls. The rain made everything feel slower, like it was stretching the last hour just to mess with me. I first noticed him about 20 minutes before closing. He wasn't inside. He was just standing out by the window, half hidden in the shadows. At first, I thought he might just be waiting for someone, but then I realized he wasn't under the awning or anything. He was just standing in the rain, letting it soak him through. His jacket was dark, and his hood was down, water dripping from his hair. He wasn't looking around like someone waiting for a ride. He was looking in. At me. I told myself not to overthink it. Sometimes people act weird. Maybe he was just trying to get out of the rain and didn't want to come inside. But the way he stood there, so still, his face pale and his eyes locked on the window, it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I busied myself behind the counter, trying to ignore him. I restocked the cigarette case, checked inventory sheets, anything to avoid looking back at the window. But every time I glanced up, he was still there, unmoving, still staring. 10 o'clock rolled around, and I told myself it was fine. He hadn't done anything. He hadn't tried to come in or knock on the window. Maybe he was just strange. I grabbed the keys from under the counter and headed toward the door to lock up. When I got closer, I could see him better through the glass. The rain had plastered his hair to his forehead, and his jacket looked like it was clinging to him. But what stood out were his hands. He wasn't just standing there. He was holding something. A pair of gloves. Thick, black leather ones. He wasn't wearing them. He was holding them out in front of him, like he was waiting to give them to someone. I stopped in my tracks, still on the inside of the door. He saw me approaching, and for the first time, he moved. He stepped closer, out of the shadows, so he was right up against the glass. He raised the gloves slightly, as if to show them to me. I didn't open the door. I didn't even unlock it. I just stood there, gripping the keys in my hand, my mind racing. Was he trying to sell them? Was he going to ask me to let him in? None of it made sense. I shook my head at him, hoping he'd take the hint and leave, but he just stayed there. His lips moved like he was saying something, but I couldn't hear him through the glass. I mouthed, "We're closed," pointing at the hour sign on the door. He didn't react. He just kept mouthing something, over and over. I thought about opening the door just to crack to hear him, but something told me not to. My gut was screaming at me to stay where I was. Instead, I took a step back, pretending to lock the door. It was already locked, but I turned the key in the air anyway, hoping he'd see the gesture and go away. He didn't. Instead, he pressed the gloves against the glass. His hands were trembling now, his fingers clutching the leather tightly. I could see his knuckles turning white. That was when I noticed something else. His jacket wasn't just wet from the rain. It was darker in some spots, and there was a streak of something down the front of it. I told myself it was just water, maybe mud from walking through puddles. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I took another step back. My hand was shaking, and I fumbled with the keys. I just needed to get to the back room and call someone, anyone. My manager, the cops, I didn't care at that point. I turned away from the door, walking quickly toward the back. As soon as I moved, I heard the sound. It was a dull, heavy thud. I turned my head just enough to see him banging the gloves against the glass. Not with force, not like he was trying to break it, but with this slow, deliberate rhythm. Like he was knocking, but using the gloves instead of his fist. My heart was pounding as I reached the counter. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, barely able to get the words out when the operator answered. I told her there was a man outside the store, acting strange, refusing to leave. She asked if he'd threatened me, and I said no, but my voice cracked as I said it. He hadn't done anything yet, but everything about him felt wrong. She told me to stay on the line, and that officers would be dispatched. I stayed crouched behind the counter, peeking out just enough to see the door. He was still there, still holding the gloves, but now he pressed his forehead against the glass too. His breath fogged up the window in short, uneven bursts. Then, just as suddenly as he'd started, he stopped. He straightened up, letting the gloves fall to his side. He stood there for a moment, staring through the window, his eyes searching the store. Then he turned and walked away. I stayed on the phone with the operator until the police arrived. They searched the lot and the surrounding area, but he was gone. The gloves were still there, lying in a puddle by the door. One of the officers picked them up, turning them over in his hands. They were soaked, and the leather had started to stiffen from the cold. "Is this blood?" he asked his partner, holding them up under the light. There were dark stains smeared across the palms, stains that hadn't come from the rain. I didn't sleep that night. I kept hearing the sound of the gloves hitting the glass, soft but insistent, like he was trying to get in. The police said they'd keep an eye out, but they didn't seem optimistic. They didn't even take the gloves with them. They just left them sitting on the counter, like some kind of forgotten relic. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I haven't worked a closing shift since. And I never will again. The station was almost completely empty that night, apart from the faint sound of the ticket machine humming and the distant rattle of wind against the overhang. I'd missed the earlier train by just a minute, so I had no choice but to wait for the last one. It was late, almost midnight, and the cold was creeping into my bones. The rain wasn't helping either. It was one of those steady, relentless rains that made everything feel heavier. I sat on the bench under the overhang, close enough to the tracks to hear the occasional drip of water from the edge of the shelter. The electronic board said the train was running 10 minutes late. I wasn't surprised, it always seemed to happen at this station. I adjusted my bag on my lap and tried to keep my focus on the platform, even though there wasn't much to look at. That's when I noticed him. At first, I thought he was just another passenger waiting for the same train. He was pacing back and forth on the far side of the platform, where the light didn't quite reach. His movements were jerky, like he couldn't decide which way to go. He'd take a few steps one way, stop, turn around, and pace back the other way. He didn't have an umbrella, and the rain was soaking through his clothes, but he didn't seem to care. His head was tilted slightly down, like he was talking to himself. I tried not to look directly at him, but it was hard to ignore him. The way he moved felt off. He wasn't in a hurry, but he wasn't relaxed either. It was like he had nowhere to be but couldn't stand still. I told myself he was probably just someone waiting, same as me. Maybe he was frustrated about the delay. People react differently to stress. I pulled out my phone and pretended to scroll through messages, though there wasn't much service out there. After a few minutes, I heard his footsteps getting closer. I didn't want to look up, but I could feel him moving toward me. The sound of his shoes on the wet concrete was louder now, slower, deliberate. He stopped a few feet away from the bench. "Waiting for the last one?" he asked. His voice was flat, neither friendly nor threatening, but it caught me off guard. I looked up, and he was staring at me. His face was pale, with dark circles under his eyes, like he hadn't slept in days. His hair was plastered to his forehead from the rain, and his clothes clung to him, heavy with water. "Yes," I said, keeping my answer short. I hoped that would end the conversation, but it didn't. "You shouldn't wait," he said, tilting his head slightly. "It's not coming." I blinked, unsure how to respond. The board still said the train was delayed, not canceled. "It's late, but it'll come," I said, trying to sound confident, even though his tone unsettled me. He shook his head slowly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "No, it never comes. Not this one." I shifted on the bench, gripping my bag tighter. "What do you mean?" He stepped closer, and I could see his hands trembling slightly. "The last one," he said, his voice lowering. "It's not like the others. You don't want to get on it." I glanced around the platform, hoping to see someone else, anyone, but we were still alone. The lights flickered briefly, and I felt a chill that wasn't just from the rain. "I think you're mistaken," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've taken the last train before." He laughed softly, but it wasn't a warm sound. It was dry and hollow. "Not this one," he said again, as if it was obvious. He moved to sit down on the bench, leaving just enough space between us that I couldn't get up without brushing past him. I thought about leaving, walking back to the ticket office, but the idea of being out there in the open felt worse somehow. At least under the overhang, I could see him. Out there, I wouldn't know if he was following me. You don't believe me, he said, watching me carefully. That's fine. Most don't. I didn't answer. I just stared at the electronic board, willing it to update, to tell me the train was finally approaching. But it stayed the same. I used to wait, too, he said after a moment. Back before I understood. Understood what? I asked, despite myself. He leaned back, tilting his face up toward the rain. That some trains aren't meant to take you anywhere you want to go. I wanted to tell him to leave me alone, but something in his voice stopped me. He sounded so sure, so certain. It was unsettling, like he wasn't just talking to me, he was warning me. The sound of a distant horn broke the tension, and I felt a surge of relief. The train was coming. I stood up, clutching my bag, but he didn't move. He just watched me with that same faint smile. It's here, I said, more to myself than to him. He shook his head again. You think it's here, but it's not. I ignored him and stepped closer to the edge of the platform. The train's headlights cut through the rain, and the horn sounded again, louder this time. I glanced back at the bench, but the man hadn't moved. He was still sitting there, staring at me. As the train pulled into the station, I felt a strange sense of unease. The windows were dark, and I couldn't see anyone inside. The doors hissed open, and I hesitated for a moment. Don't, the man said softly behind me. Just walk away. I turned to look at him, and for the first time, his expression changed. He wasn't smiling anymore. His face was tense, almost pleading. I don't know why I listened. Maybe it was the way he looked at me, or maybe it was just instinct, but I took a step back from the train. The door stayed open, waiting, but I didn't move. After a moment, the doors closed, and the train started to pull away. I watched it disappear into the rain, and the platform was silent again. When I turned back to the bench, the man was gone. There was no sign of him anywhere on the platform or in the parking lot. It was like he'd vanished. I waited for the next train, and it came without any trouble. But I've never stopped thinking about that night, and I've never taken the last train again. I don't know what would have happened if I'd gotten on, but I don't want to find out. It happened last fall. I remember the night because I was running late for work, and I just made the decision to take a shortcut. I had just gotten off the bus, and my office was still a 10-minute walk ahead, but I knew there was a construction site in the middle of the block, and if I cut through, I could save at least 5 minutes. I had walked through that site many times before. It was quiet after hours, and there was never anyone around. It was dark, but I wasn't worried about that. There were streetlights lining the street and enough ambient light that I could see the path ahead of me. Still, I had the unsettling feeling of being alone, like everything around me was too still, but I shook it off. I just needed to get to work, so I walked toward the site. As I approached the entrance, I could hear the usual noises, tools and materials piled up, the remnants of the day's work. The path was pretty simple, just a wide space between piles of metal rods and construction debris, but the area was dim. I could barely make out the edges of the sidewalk, so I had to watch where I was stepping. But nothing seemed off. I just kept walking, trying to hurry up a little since I had about 10 minutes before I was supposed to be at my desk. After a few steps, I heard something. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct, a sound that I couldn't ignore. Footsteps. I stopped and listened. For a second, I thought I had imagined it, but then I heard them again. Slow, heavy steps, echoing off the steel beams and concrete walls. My heart jumped in my chest, and I turned around. I didn't see anyone, but the footsteps were still there, faint but undeniably close. I didn't panic at first. It was just a construction worker. Maybe they had stayed late, or maybe someone else was taking the shortcut, too. I didn't see anyone else, but the sound was unmistakable. Someone was following me. I picked up the pace. My mind was racing, but I tried to keep my footsteps calm. I didn't want to look like I was running from nothing. I glanced back once more, but the only thing I saw was the stretch of concrete ahead. Nothing. But the footsteps kept coming, matching my pace. That's when I started to feel the real weight of it. Something about the sound, the fact that it was getting closer, made my stomach churn. I quickened my step, trying to move faster through the narrow alley between construction crates and abandoned machinery. But the footsteps, still slow at first, sped up too. Whoever was behind me wasn't keeping their distance anymore. They were getting closer, following my every move. I looked ahead, saw nothing but dark shadows cast by the scattered light from the street behind me. There was no clear exit. The sight stretched on, just a long series of twists and turns with walls and debris blocking the way. I tried to stay calm, tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was just a person walking at the same pace, but no, something about the sound felt deliberate, almost like whoever was behind me was pacing me, waiting for the moment I would speed up. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears now, and the footsteps kept getting closer. I was definitely not imagining it anymore. They were right behind me, close enough that I could almost hear breathing. I broke into a jog. I didn't think. I just did it. I needed to get out. I needed to get away from whatever was following me. The area was still quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. The sound of those footsteps was relentless, echoing in the darkness. As I ran, I heard the footsteps pick up speed too, gaining on me. The sound was louder, closer, but I couldn't bring myself to look back. I had no idea what kind of person I was dealing with, and I wasn't about to find out. My mind raced as I tried to figure out where I could go. My feet hit the cracked pavement as I turned a corner. There was a small alleyway ahead, and I thought if I could make it there, I could at least break the line of sight. But I didn't make it. The sound of footsteps behind me shifted, and for a split second, I thought I'd lost whoever was following. But then I heard them turn the corner. They were still there. They were still following me. I could feel them gaining on me. I pushed myself harder, my body screaming from the effort, my breath coming out in sharp bursts. The alley was just ahead, but I wasn't sure I could make it. The chase was on now, and I could hear the person's footsteps just a few steps behind me, growing closer, echoing louder in the dark. Every breath felt sharp, and my legs were starting to give out. I saw the alleys opening up ahead and pushed myself harder. Finally, I made it to the corner, turned it, and broke into the next part of the site. I wasn't sure where I was anymore, but I was still moving. I thought I could make it to the exit just a little farther down the road, but I wasn't sure how much longer I could run like this. I felt the cold in my chest, the fear sinking in deeper with every step. Just as I thought I might be in the clear, I heard a voice. "Hey!" It was low, but it rang clear in the night air. I didn't look back, but I felt my whole body go cold. That voice. It wasn't just someone trying to get my attention. It was threatening. It was saying my name,